My name is Haley Jenkins. I am 29 years old and I am a senior corporate auditor in Chicago. Today, my life is measured in balance sheets, forensic financial reports, and uncovering the hidden truths people try to bury deep within corporate ledgers. I have built a lucrative career on being the person who notices the tiny details everyone else ignores. People often ask me how I developed such a sharp eye for deception. I usually give them a polite, polished answer about my university training and years of rigorous professional experience. But the real answer is much darker. The truth is, I learned to spot lies because I had to survive them. Growing up, I was the invisible scapegoat in a household that thrived on maintaining a picture-perfect illusion for the outside world. While my older sister was paraded around as the flawless golden child I was, the designated receptacle for every mistake, every misplaced item, and every simmering resentment my parents harbored. If a vase broke, I was clumsy. If money was tight, I was too expensive to raise. I learned very early that my reality did not matter to them. Only their narrative mattered. To survive the constant gaslighting and emotional whiplash, I retreated into a world of facts and logic. I became quiet, observant, and intensely analytical. I watched how people moved, how their stories shifted, and how the numbers never actually added up when they tried to explain away their failures. I internalized the profound pain of being the one thrown under the bus, using it not as a reason to give up, but as the fuel to become unbreakable. My mind became a steel trap for inconsistencies, because when you are constantly told that you are the problem, you have to gather ironclad evidence just to prove your own sanity. I did not know it then, but every unfair accusation and every cruel remark was quietly training me for the exact moment my family would try to destroy me completely. I lived in a state of hypervigilance, always bracing for the next storm, always calculating the safest route through the emotional minefield of my own home. My survival depended on reading the room before the room even knew what it wanted to do. That hyper-awareness kept me alive, but it could not protect me from the ultimate betrayal. They did not just humiliate me, they orchestrated a public execution of my character. Picture this. It was a freezing Christmas dinner, the table groaning under the weight of an expensive feast I had spent all day cooking. We were surrounded by 30 extended family members, friends and neighbors, all holding crystal wine glasses and laughing. Then the laughter stopped. One by one, starting with my father, they stood up. They did not just ask me to leave. They looked me dead in the eye and proudly declared to the entire room that I was a thief, a liar, and no longer a part of the family. At barely 17 years old, I stood frozen in my apron as I lost everything in a single terrifying instant. My home, my safety, my family, all stripped away while everyone I had ever known watched in silent agreement. My mother, Susan, pointed a manicured finger toward the front door, her voice dripping with absolute disgust as she told me to pack a garbage bag and get out into the snow. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I thought it would break. The room fell completely silent. Nobody moved to help me. Nobody defended me. I was entirely alone, bracing myself for the freezing cold reality of the streets. But just as I turned to walk away, an unexpected person cleared his throat. A voice that had no business speaking up finally broke the silence, and in a matter of seconds, everything changed. This person saw right through the performance. He saw the glaring holes in the story my parents had so carefully crafted. He did not yell or scream. He simply spoke with the calm, devastating precision of someone who knew exactly how to dismantle a lie. And that single moment of unexpected intervention shifted the trajectory of my entire life, setting into motion a chain of events they could never have predicted. Before I tell you exactly who stood up for me and what he said, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been the one who carried the blame for everything your family did wrong? Have you ever felt the crushing weight of being the designated villain in a story you did not even write? If you know what it is like to be the family scapegoat, drop a comment below with where you are watching from and what time it is. I want to see you and connect with you. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel, because what I did next, how I took their ultimate betrayal and weaponized it to uncover a massive web of deceit, is for all of us who were ever told we were the problem. Your support helps these stories reach people who desperately need to hear that they can fight back and win. Now let me take you back to that freezing December night in 2012. I was 17, standing in the sweltering kitchen of our upscale suburban home, furiously polishing silver and checking the roast in the oven. I had a massive burn blister on my left wrist from slipping against the hot oven door, but I did not dare stop to put ice on it. Stopping meant giving my mother a reason to complain. Through the swinging kitchen door, I could hear the clinking of glasses and the obnoxious booming laugh of my father, Richard. He was holding court in the living room, pouring expensive scotch for my uncles. Sitting right beside him, completely radiant and practically glowing with entitlement, was my 19-year-old sister, Jessica. Jessica was the indisputable golden child, beautiful, constantly coddled, and currently showing off the massive diamond ring from her brand new fiancé. His name was Marcus Sterling, a brilliant and observant African-American corporate attorney who sat quietly on the edge of the sofa, watching our family dynamic with a look of polite but unmistakable unease. It was Christmas Eve 2012. I was 17 years old and trapped in a kitchen that felt more like a commercial furnace than a home. My mother had invited 30 loud guests for our annual holiday dinner, and per usual, she delegated the entire preparation to me. I was managing 4 different pots on the stove, a massive turkey in the oven, and a dining room table that needed to be set perfectly. Sweat was pooling at the base of my neck. My mother, Susan, was currently in the living room holding court, ensuring her wine glass was never empty. I was her invisible staff. Every few minutes, she would shout an order through the swinging wooden door, reminding me not to ruin the gravy or overcook the green beans. I was used to it. In the Jenkins household, labor was my assigned currency. I paid for my existence by making sure their lives ran flawlessly. I started working on my grandmother's vintage silver cutlery. As I rubbed the tarnish off a heavy serving spoon, I could hear the loud musical laugh of my 19-year-old sister floating in from the living room. Jessica. The name alone carried a certain weight in our house. She was the golden child, the undeniable center of my parents' entire universe. Where I was expected to be useful, Jessica was only expected to be beautiful. She was currently a sophomore at a very expensive private university studying art history on my parents' dime. She had never cooked a meal, never scrubbed a floor, and certainly never polished a piece of silver. Everything in her life was handed to her on a silver platter, the very platter I was currently buffing to a mirror shine. The loud pop of fat sputtering in the oven pulled me away from the cutlery. I dropped the rag and grabbed a pair of thick fabric mitts. The turkey needed to be basted. I crouched down and pulled open the heavy oven door. A blast of dry, intensely searing heat hit my face. I reached in with a heavy metal spoon to scoop up the drippings, but as I leaned forward, my foot slipped on a tiny splash of olive oil. My left wrist slammed directly against the exposed metal rack inside the hot oven. A sharp, blinding pain shot up my arm. I gasped, stumbling backward and clutching my wrist. A bright red burn mark was rising on my skin. The pain was excruciating, throbbing with every heartbeat. I stood there, panting frantically, fighting the urge to cry out. But I knew better than to make a scene. If I went out there crying, my mother would accuse me of ruining the holiday mood. My father would tell me to stop being dramatic. And Jessica would simply roll her eyes, so I bit my lip hard enough to draw blood. Ran my wrist under cold water for exactly 30 seconds, wrapped it tightly in a paper towel, and went back to work. My pain was an inconvenience to them. I needed a serving platter from the dining room, so I pushed open the swinging kitchen door just a crack. Through the narrow opening, I had a perfect view of the living room. The fireplace was roaring. The Christmas tree was glowing with hundreds of warm white lights. Sitting right in the center of the plush velvet sofa was Jessica. She was wearing a stunning emerald green silk dress my mother bought specifically for tonight. Her blonde hair was styled in perfect waves. She was holding out her left hand, letting the firelight catch the massive diamond ring on her finger. My aunts and cousins were practically climbing over each other to admire it. Jessica was glowing, soaking up the attention. She had just gotten engaged 2 months prior, and this dinner was as much an engagement celebration as it was a holiday gathering. My parents were beaming with pride, acting as though Jessica had single-handedly cured a major disease, and the man she was marrying was sitting right next to her, Marcus Sterling. Marcus was a corporate attorney at a massive firm in downtown Chicago. He was African-American, impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, and possessed an undeniable air of quiet authority. He did not fit in with my loud family. While everyone else was fawning over Jessica and the ring, Marcus sat slightly back into the cushions. He had a polite smile on his face, but his eyes were sharp. He was deeply observant, the kind of man who read contracts for a living and knew how to spot hidden clauses. I watched him scan the room, taking in my father, boasting loudly about his golf game, and my mother bragging about her country club status. Then his gaze drifted toward the kitchen door. He caught me looking. He saw my flushed face, the sweat on my brow, and the clumsy paper towel wrapped around my burnt wrist. He saw the apron stained with gravy and the absolute exhaustion in my posture. For a brief second, our eyes met. His polite smile vanished, replaced by a subtle frown. He looked from me back to Jessica, who was currently complaining that her champagne was not cold enough. I saw the gears turning in his head. Marcus was brilliant, and he was quickly putting the pieces together. He was beginning to realize that the pristine, perfect Jenkins family was built on the silent, unpaid labor of a 17-year-old girl hidden away in the kitchen. He shifted in his seat, a quiet unease settling over his broad shoulders. He recognized the profound imbalance in the room. He did not say a word, but in that fleeting moment of eye contact, I knew that Marcus Sterling saw exactly what was happening. He saw me, and that alone was terrifying, because in my family, being seen usually meant you were about to be severely punished. Dinner was finally served. Carrying the massive 20-pound roasted turkey from the cramped kitchen to the sprawling dining room required every ounce of physical strength I had left. My burnt wrist throbbed with a dull, agonizing rhythm under the long sleeve of the cheap black cardigan I had thrown on over my gravy-stained dress. The dining room was a sea of loud voices, clinking crystal goblets, and the overpowering scent of pine needles mixed with expensive, heavy perfumes. 30 people were cramming themselves around the extended mahogany table. There were aunts, uncles, cousins, and my parents' most influential country club friends. It took me another 20 minutes of non-stop moving to bring out the steaming bowls of mashed potatoes, the green bean casserole, the fresh dinner rolls, and the homemade cranberry sauce. My mother, Susan, sat at the head of the table opposite my father, smiling graciously as guests continuously complimented the incredible spread of food. She accepted their praise effortlessly, never once mentioning that she had not lifted a single finger to prepare any of it. I finally sank into a small, unstable folding chair at the very end of the table, positioned right next to the swinging kitchen door. It was the designated kid seat, despite the fact that I was 17 years old and practically an adult. I poured myself a small glass of ice water, my hands shaking slightly from pure physical exhaustion and the lingering pain of the burn. I looked down at my empty porcelain plate, too tired to even serve myself a portion of the meal I had spent 9 solid hours cooking. But for a fleeting moment, I felt a tiny sliver of genuine relief. The hardest part of the day was finally over. The food was perfectly cooked and safely on the table. Now all I had to do was stay perfectly quiet, eat quickly, and start washing the massive mountain of greasy pots and pans waiting for me in the kitchen sink. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the warmth of the crowded room wash over me. That was my first monumental mistake. I let my guard down. Suddenly, the booming sound of a silver serving spoon aggressively tapping against a heavy crystal wineglass shattered the low hum of dinner conversation. The sharp, rhythmic clinking echoed through the large dining room. I looked up. At the far end of the long mahogany table, my father Richard pushed back his heavy wooden chair and stood up. He was an imposing man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a tailored navy suit that screamed absolute financial success. A sudden hush fell over the room. 30 faces turned in unison to look at him. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Silver forks were gently placed down on porcelain plates. Everyone in the room fully expected a heartwarming toast. It was Christmas Eve, and more importantly, it was the official family gathering to celebrate Jessica and Marcus getting engaged. Jessica sat up straighter, smoothing an imaginary wrinkle from her emerald silk dress. A perfectly rehearsed look of modest anticipation painted across her flawless face. My mother smiled warmly at my father, her eyes glittering with immense pride. I leaned back in my folding chair, wrapping my cold hands around my glass of ice water, completely ready to endure a 10-minute speech about how incredible and perfect my older sister was. But my father did not raise his wine glass. He did not offer a warm holiday greeting or a sentimental blessing for the engaged couple. Instead, he reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a thick, folded stack of papers. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The warm holiday cheer seemed to completely evaporate, replaced by a sudden heavy and suffocating tension. My father looked down at the papers, then slowly swept his gaze across the expectant faces of our extended family. When his eyes finally landed on me, sitting alone at the far end of the table, they were entirely devoid of warmth. They were cold, calculating, and vicious. My stomach instantly dropped. A sudden wave of intense nausea hit me so hard, I had to grip the edge of the table to steady myself. I did not know what those papers were, but the terrifying look on his face told me my punishment had arrived. When he spoke, his voice was not filled with the booming, jovial tone he usually used on the golf course. It was low, trembling, with a perfectly manufactured layer of grief and righteous anger. He told the silent room that tonight was supposed to be a night of pure, joyous celebration. He talked about how hard he and my mother had worked their entire lives to provide a beautiful and secure life for their daughters. He mentioned the countless sacrifices they had made, the long, grueling hours he had spent building his business, all to ensure that his family would never want for anything in this world. He pointed directly at Jessica, praising her bright future, her stunning engagement, and the wonderful life she was about to build with Marcus. And then he dropped the absolute bomb. He announced to the 30 people staring at him that earlier that afternoon, he had gone to the local bank branch to transfer the funds for Jessica's upcoming wedding venue deposit. But the money was not there. He paused, letting the heavy silence stretch until it was nearly unbearable. He looked directly into my eyes and stated that exactly $40,000 had been drained from Jessica's wedding and college fund. The collective gasp from the long table was deafening. 30 pairs of eyes snapped away from my father and locked entirely onto me. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird trying to escape. I could not breathe. I could not speak. The accusation was so massive, so entirely out of nowhere, that my brain simply short-circuited. $40,000. It was an astronomical sum of money. I was a 17-year-old high school student who did not even have a driver license or a part-time job at the mall. I owned exactly $32 in a cheap floral piggy bank hidden under my bed. I opened my mouth to defend myself, to say that it was completely impossible, that he was making a terrible, catastrophic mistake. But before a single word could escape my throat, my father began walking down the length of the long table. His heavy footsteps thudded loudly against the polished hardwood floor. Every guest watched his march in horrified fascination. He stopped right next to my small folding chair. I looked up at him, my vision blurring with unshed tears, silently pleading with him to stop this incredibly cruel joke. Instead, he violently slammed the thick stack of papers directly onto my empty porcelain dinner plate. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. "Read them," he ordered, his voice echoing fiercely. "Look at what you did." My hands were trembling so violently I could barely grasp the edges of the pages. I looked down. They were official bank statements printed on thick, high-quality paper, complete with the blue and white corporate logo of my parents' primary financial institution. My eyes darted frantically across the complex columns of numbers, desperate to find the banking error, desperate to prove him wrong. But the numbers were definitely there, clear as day. The printed statements showed a joint savings account, the one my parents had supposedly set up years ago for Jessica. And there, highlighted in bright neon yellow ink, was a series of massive wire transfers. $5,000 here, $10,000 there. Month after month, large chunks of cash were being systematically siphoned out of the joint account. I followed the columns across the page to the listed destination account. The breath completely left my lungs. My vision tunneled into a dark point. The destination account, the place where all $40,000 had gone, was clearly labeled. It had my full legal name on it. Haley Jenkins, complete with my exact date of birth and my private social security number printed right below it. The printed evidence looked absolutely flawless. It looked undeniably real. Pure panic clawed at my throat. I stared at my own name printed in bold black ink, my mind frantically spinning out of control. How was this remotely possible? I had never opened a bank account in my entire life. I had never walked into a bank branch, never signed a financial document, never even seen a debit card. Yet here was concrete, undeniable proof sitting on my dinner plate, declaring to the entire world that I was a calculating, cold-blooded thief who had ruthlessly stolen her own sister's entire future. I looked up frantically, searching the shocked faces around the table for a single ounce of doubt, a single desperate lifeline. I looked at my aunts, the women who had watched me grow up from a toddler. They were staring at me with expressions of pure disgust. I looked at my older cousins, who were whispering frantically to each other, pointing at me like I was a dangerous monster. I looked at Jessica. She had dramatically buried her face in her hands, her narrow shoulders shaking as she let out a loud theatrical sob. My mother immediately rushed over to comfort her, wrapping her arms protectively around her golden child, shooting me a glare so intensely venomous it physically burned my skin. I tried to speak. I pushed the heavy papers away, my voice cracking as I choked out the words. I did not do this. I swear I did not do this. I do not even have a bank account. I do not know what these papers are. But my voice was terribly weak, high-pitched, and trembling with sheer panic. It sounded exactly like the voice of a guilty person caught completely red-handed. My father scoffed loudly, a harsh, deeply dismissive sound that easily cut through my pathetic defense. He pointed a thick, angry finger at the highlighted bank statements. The money went from our family account directly into an account registered under your social security number. The branch manager personally confirmed it this afternoon. Are you calling the bank a liar? Are you calling your own father a liar? I was completely trapped. The sheer logical impossibility of the situation crushed my chest. I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that I was innocent. I knew I had spent the last 7 years of my life quietly serving this family, trying desperately to stay completely out of the way, trying to be just good enough to earn a single tiny scrap of their affection. But the printed reality sitting on my plate boldly said otherwise. The physical paper evidence painted me as a mastermind criminal. The logic did not matter. The actual truth did not matter. The only thing that mattered to anyone in that room was the terrifying story my father had just handed them. He had constructed a flawless narrative of my ultimate betrayal, backed by forged financial documents that I completely lacked the resources and literacy to challenge. I sat frozen in my folding chair, the burnt skin on my wrist violently throbbing in perfect time with my racing heart. I was surrounded by 30 people, but I had never been more utterly alone in my entire life. The trap had been meticulously set, the poison bait had been fully swallowed by the audience, and the steel jaws had just violently snapped shut around my neck. The heavy silence in the dining room shattered the moment Jessica decided it was time to take center stage. She let out a loud, dramatic wail that sounded entirely practiced, a theatrical sob designed to draw every ounce of sympathy in the room directly to her. She buried her face in her hands, her narrow shoulders heaving as she leaned heavily against Marcus, practically collapsing into his side. "How could you do this to me, Haley?" she cried out, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "My wedding, my future. How could you be so incredibly selfish and evil?" She did not shed a single actual tear, but the sheer volume of her manufactured grief was enough to activate the entire room. My mother immediately sprang into action, rushing around the long table to wrap her arms protectively around her precious golden child. She stroked Jessica's blonde hair, glaring at me with a level of pure, unadulterated hatred that I had never seen before. It was a look reserved for a monster, not a 17-year-old daughter. "You ruined everything," Jessica wailed loudly into our mother's shoulder. She knew exactly what she was doing. She knew she had no evidence, no logical reason to believe I could pull off a $40,000 bank heist, but the truth was irrelevant. This was her moment to be the ultimate victim, and she was going to milk every single second of it. I sat frozen in my folding chair, the harsh glare of the dining room chandelier blinding me as the reality of my situation began to truly sink in. My own sister was willingly participating in my execution. My mother slowly pulled away from Jessica and stood up straight. She smoothed down her expensive silk dress and turned her full, terrifying attention onto me. Susan Jenkins was a woman who cared about two things in life: her social standing and her eldest daughter. I was merely an afterthought, an inconvenience she had been forced to tolerate for 17 years. Now she finally had the perfect excuse to discard me completely. She walked slowly toward my end of the table, her high heels clicking sharply against the polished hardwood floor. Every step sounded like a judge bringing down a heavy wooden gavel. She stopped right in front of my chair, towering over me. I looked up at her, my vision completely blurred with hot panic tears. "Mom, please," I begged, my voice breaking into a pathetic whisper. "You know me. You know I did not do this. Please, Mom, you have to believe me." But there was no maternal warmth in her eyes. There was only cold, calculating wrath. She raised her right arm and pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly toward the heavy oak front door at the end of the hallway. Her voice was terrifyingly calm, devoid of any emotion, as she delivered the sentence that would permanently sever our relationship. "If you can steal from your own sister, you are no daughter of mine." The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. "You are no daughter of mine." It felt as though she had reached into my chest and crushed my heart with her bare hands. The absolute finality in her tone made it entirely clear that this was not a misunderstanding. This was an eviction. The moment my mother officially disowned me, it was as if a dam had broken in the dining room. The rest of the family took her words as a green light to unleash their own vicious attacks. My Aunt Barbara, a woman who had bought me a stuffed bear when I was born, slammed her wine glass down onto the table. "I always knew there was something wrong with you," she sneered loudly. "You were always so quiet, always sneaking around, a filthy little thief right under our noses." My Uncle Thomas chimed in immediately, his face red with alcohol and misplaced righteous anger. "You are a complete disgrace to this family, Haley," he shouted across the table. "After everything your parents have done for you, putting a roof over your head, feeding you, and you repay them by robbing your own flesh and blood. You make me sick." The chorus of insults grew louder and faster. Disgrace, liar, criminal, monster. The words flew at me from every direction, sharp and stinging like physical blows. 30 people, my own blood relatives, were openly mocking and degrading me. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing my hands over my ears to block out the overwhelming noise. But it was useless. I was completely cornered. I curled into myself on that tiny, unstable folding chair, sobbing uncontrollably. The tears I had fought so hard to hold back finally spilled over, streaming down my hot face and soaking the collar of my cheap cardigan. I was crying so hard I could barely pull air into my lungs. I was drowning in their hatred, suffocating under the weight of an impossible lie that they had also eagerly accepted as the undeniable truth. My father marched back over to me aggressively, grabbing my shoulder and yanking me upright. "Stop your pathetic crying," he barked violently. "You have absolutely no right to play the victim here." He held out his large, calloused hand, palm facing up. "Give me your phone. Give me your house keys. Right now." I stared at him in utter disbelief. My phone was the only lifeline I had to the outside world, the only way I could call a friend or look for a place to stay. My keys were the only proof that I actually lived here, that I belonged somewhere. "Dad, please." I sobbed, my entire body violently shaking. "Where am I supposed to go? It is Christmas Eve. I do not have any money. I do not have anywhere to sleep." "I do not care," he snapped coldly, his face inches from mine. "You should have thought about that before you robbed your family blind. Hand them over, Haley, or I will call the police right now and have you dragged out of here in handcuffs. For stealing $40,000, they will lock you away for years." The threat of police and prison paralyzed me. My trembling hands reached into the pockets of my cardigan. I pulled out my scratched plastic phone and the small metal keyring holding my house key. I placed them slowly into his waiting palm. The moment the metal keys left my fingers, I felt my entire safety net vanish. I was officially a ghost in my own home. My father shoved the phone and keys into his pocket, looking at me with pure disgust. I turned my head slightly and looked past my father toward the large bay window in the living room. Outside, the world was completely dark. A massive winter storm had rolled into the suburbs earlier that afternoon, and the snow was falling heavily, piling up in thick, freezing drifts on the front lawn. The wind was howling, rattling the expensive glass panes. It was easily below zero out there, and I was wearing a thin dress, a cheap sweater, and a pair of worn-out flat shoes. I was being thrown out into a literal blizzard with absolutely nothing. "You have exactly 5 minutes to go upstairs and pack one single bag," my mother commanded from across the room. "One bag. Only the clothes you absolutely need. Leave the jewelry, leave the electronics, leave anything we paid for. If you take one extra item, I swear to God I will press charges for theft. I stood up slowly. My legs felt like they were made of heavy lead. The agonizing throbbing in my burnt wrist flared up again, a sharp physical reminder of the hours I had just spent cooking the feast they were currently abandoning to watch my destruction. The entire dining room watched me in absolute dead silence as I took my first trembling step toward the hallway stairs. Nobody stepped forward to offer a coat. Nobody offered to drive me to a warm shelter. Nobody even looked away. They just watched me, their eyes hard and completely devoid of any human empathy. The sheer cruelty of the moment was entirely paralyzing. I could smell the rich aroma of the roasted turkey and the sweet scent of the cranberry sauce I had just prepared, a massive, beautiful feast that was meant to bring people closer together, now serving as the bitterly ironic background scent to my ultimate banishment. Every stair I climbed felt like stepping closer to my own funeral. I was being erased from their lives, tossed out like a piece of defective property they no longer wanted to deal with. I was a terrified 17-year-old girl walking alone to my childhood bedroom to pack my entire existence into a thin plastic garbage bag, stepping toward the freezing cold abyss of a dark winter night without a single soul in the world to protect me. I dragged my feet down the long hallway toward the front door. In my right hand, I clutched a thin black plastic garbage bag. Inside were 3 pairs of worn-out jeans, a few oversized sweaters, and whatever socks I could grab in the 5 minutes my mother had allotted me. The cheap plastic stretched and tore slightly under the heavy weight of my meager belongings. The house was completely silent behind me. 30 people sat perfectly still in the formal dining room, watching my slow, humiliating march to the exit. I reached the heavy oak front door and wrapped my trembling fingers around the freezing brass handle. The cold metal bit sharply into my warm skin. I hesitated for a fraction of a second. Outside, the heavy winter wind was screaming against the frosted glass panes of the entryway. The snow was blowing horizontally in the absolute darkness of the Christmas Eve storm. I had nowhere to go. I had no money. I had no cell phone. I did not even have a winter coat. I only had a garbage bag and the thin clothes on my back. I took a slow, deep breath and prepared to turn the brass handle and step out into the freezing blizzard. But before the heavy latch could click open, the distinct sound of a large wooden chair scraping loudly against the dining room floor echoed down the long hallway. I froze in place. The quiet murmur of the freezing wind outside was suddenly broken by a set of calm, measured footsteps, deliberately approaching the entryway. I turned my head slowly over my shoulder. Marcus Sterling was walking toward me. He had left his comfortable seat beside Jessica. He did not look angry. He did not look completely shocked or horrified like the rest of the silent dinner guests. Instead, he looked entirely in his element, fully awake and intensely focused. He stopped a few feet away from me and turned his body to face my parents, who were still standing rigidly at the head of the long dining table. When Marcus spoke, his voice was not loud. He did not yell or raise his tone to match the chaotic, aggressive energy my family had just violently displayed. He used his professional courtroom voice. It was a deeply resonant, perfectly modulated tone that instantly commanded absolute authority and demanded total silence from everyone in the vicinity. "Richard," he began, addressing my father directly with a chilling calm. "I have been listening to this entire dramatic exchange and sitting here looking closely at the financial documents you just slammed onto the porcelain dinner plate. As a corporate attorney who handles complex finance and custodial accounts on a daily basis, I feel professionally compelled to point out a few glaring logical impossibilities in your current narrative." The massive room held its collective breath. My father blinked rapidly, his face suddenly losing a significant fraction of its flushed, righteous anger. Marcus took a slow, deliberate step back toward the dining room, keeping his sharp, observant eyes locked entirely on my frozen parents. He pointed a long, steady finger at the bank statements still resting on the table. He stated plainly to the room that the account in question was a standard custodial savings account. He explained to the 30 silent guests that under standard federal banking regulations and the Uniform Transfers to Minors Act, a 17-year-old child possesses absolutely zero legal authority to initiate a wire transfer of $40,000. He told my father that a minor cannot even walk into a local bank branch and withdraw $50 from a custodial account without the primary custodian physically present. The primary custodian is the adult who originally opened the account. He paused deliberately, letting the heavy weight of the law settle over the luxurious dining room. He looked directly into my father's eyes and stated that for $40,000 to be successfully moved from that joint account to any other destination, it would strictly require the physical signature, the verified government identification, and the explicit legal authorization of the adult custodian. And since Haley is a minor, she could not possibly be the legal custodian. Therefore, Marcus concluded, his voice completely level and devoid of emotion. The only person who could have legally authorized the transfer of those substantial funds is the adult whose name is explicitly printed on the primary account documents. Which means, Richard, either your bank has committed a massive unprecedented violation of federal banking law by allowing a blind transaction from a minor or someone who actually has custodial access to those funds, moved the money themselves, and is currently using Haley as a highly convenient scapegoat. The silence that immediately followed his logical breakdown was absolute. It was a thick, suffocating, entirely heavy quiet that completely consumed the sprawling room. You could clearly hear the snow hitting the window panes. My parents completely froze in their tracks. The color drained entirely from my father's face, leaving him looking sickly pale and suddenly very old. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound emerged. My mother, Susan, tried to speak, but her throat seemed paralyzed. She just stood there, gripping the back of her expensive wooden chair, her knuckles turning completely white from the sheer force of her grip. Jessica stopped her loud theatrical sobbing instantly. She looked up at Marcus with wide, terrified eyes, slowly realizing that her brilliant, highly successful fiancé was systematically dismantling the flawless story they had just confidently fed him. My aunts and uncles, who had been aggressively screaming cruel insults at me just moments before, were now staring awkwardly down at their empty plates, entirely unable to make eye contact with anyone in the room. Marcus had completely stripped away the emotional manipulation and exposed the cold, hard facts. The narrative they had built to destroy my life was legally and logically impossible. Marcus did not blow up his engagement right then and there. He did not dramatically throw his diamond ring onto the table or scream at Jessica for lying to his face. He was a master of legal strategy, and he knew perfectly well that showing his entire hand in a room full of highly hostile people was a severe tactical error. He let his heavy word hang in the air, a silent but undeniable warning that he knew exactly what they were doing in the dark. Then he turned his broad back on my frozen parents and walked the rest of the way down the dimly lit hallway to where I was still standing by the heavy front door. He stopped right in front of me, using his tall frame to completely block my body from the view of the dining room. He reached out and gently placed his large, warm hand directly over my trembling, icy fingers that were still tightly gripping the brass door handle. "Look at me, Haley," he whispered, his voice so incredibly low and steady that only I could possibly hear him over the sound of the wind. I looked up into his sharp, observant eyes, tears still freely streaming down my hot cheeks. He reached into the inner silk pocket of his tailored suit jacket and quickly withdrew a thick, crisp, white business card. Folded neatly underneath the thick cardstock was a crisp $100 bill. He smoothly and discreetly slid the professional card and the hidden money directly into the front pocket of my cheap black cardigan, pressing his heavy hand against the thin fabric for a brief second to ensure it was completely secure. "Do not say a single word right now," he murmured quietly. "Take this money, keep your head down, and get out of this house as fast as you can. Call the private number written on the back of the card when you are completely safe and out of the cold. Do not trust them with anything ever again." Before I could even begin to mentally process what he had just done for me, he stepped back and offered me a polite, completely neutral nod. It was the formal nod of a stranger saying a brief goodbye at a bus stop. He had just handed me a hidden weapon and a desperate financial lifeline, but he could not physically save me from the storm raging outside. I stood there, clutching the heavy garbage bag, feeling the stiff paper of the business card burning a hot hole in my pocket. My parents were slowly beginning to recover from their initial shock. I could see my father taking a deep, angry breath, his face turning red once again as he prepared to launch another aggressive verbal assault to quickly cover his newly exposed lies. But before Richard could utter a single desperate syllable, another unexpected sound stopped him entirely. It was the slow, highly rhythmic tapping of a heavy wooden walking cane striking deliberately against the polished hardwood floor. From the dark, unused corner of the formal living room, a solitary figure slowly stood up. It was Mr. Caldwell. He was my late grandfather's eccentric and perpetually silent estate lawyer. He was a rigid man, well into his late 70s, with a head of thick white hair and a permanently stern, unyielding expression. My parents had only invited him to the Christmas Eve dinner out of sheer social obligation, simply because he still legally managed a small financial trust left behind by my grandfather years ago. Mr. Caldwell had sat completely still in the corner leather armchair all evening, nursing a single glass of amber bourbon and completely ignoring the loud, chaotic energy around him. Nobody had paid him any attention whatsoever. We all naturally assumed he was half asleep or simply waiting for the dinner to conclude. But he was not asleep at all. He had been quietly watching absolutely everything unfold. Mr. Caldwell walked slowly into the bright light of the main hallway, leaning heavily on his carved wooden cane with every deliberate step. He did not look at my angry parents. He did not look at Jessica. He walked directly up to me. He looked down at the thin, torn plastic garbage bag in my shaking hand and then looked up at my wet, tear-stained face. His wrinkled expression was completely unreadable, carved from solid stone. He reached out and gently took the heavy garbage bag from my trembling grip, holding it securely in his own weathered hand. Then he turned his head slowly to look directly at my parents, who were now watching him with a complex mixture of utter confusion and rapidly mounting dread. His voice, when he finally spoke, was gravelly and incredibly dry-sounding, like old thick parchment paper rubbing together in a quiet room. He did not offer a loud argument or a complex legal defense like Marcus had just done. He simply delivered a statement of absolute undeniable finality. "Pack your heavy winter coat, Haley," he said, his tone, leaving absolutely zero room for any negotiation or debate. "You are coming with me right now." I walked out into the freezing Chicago winter, clutching my torn garbage bag and leaving the only life I had ever known completely behind. Mr. Caldwell did not say a single word as he gently led me to his heavy black sedan parked at the edge of the snowy driveway. He simply opened the passenger door, waited for me to sit down on the cold leather seat, and turned the heater up to its absolute maximum setting. As we drove away from the massive colonial house, I watched the warm yellow lights of my childhood home disappear into the swirling blizzard through the side mirror. I did not cry. I think my body was in too much severe shock to produce any more tears. The drive to his house, in the older, much quieter part of the city, was completely silent. Mr. Caldwell was a man who understood that some emotional wounds are entirely too deep for empty words of comfort. He brought me into his modest brick home, pointed to a spare guest bedroom down the hall, and told me I could stay as long as I needed. He did not ask for rent. He did not demand a complex explanation. He just provided a warm bed, a solid door with a lock, and the first actual sense of absolute safety I had felt in my entire 17 years of existence. Living with Mr. Caldwell was like learning how to breathe all over again. He was eccentric and rigidly structured, but he was entirely fair. He taught me that I did not have to constantly earn my right to simply exist in a house. He gave me the quiet space I desperately needed to heal, but I also knew I could not rely on his immense charity forever. I had to build my own life from the absolute ground up. Fast forward 3 long, grueling years, I was 20 years old and completely submerged in the exhausting but deeply empowering rhythm of absolute independence. I had cut all ties with my biological family. I had not spoken to my parents or Jessica since the horrific night they threw me out into the snow. I threw myself entirely into raw survival and building a solid foundation they could never take away from me again. I was enrolled full-time at a local state university, taking every single available class to earn my degree in accounting. Why accounting? Because numbers simply do not lie. Numbers do not emotionally manipulate you. They do not gaslight you, and they do not throw you out into the freezing cold. I wanted to understand the universal language of money so deeply that no one could ever use it as a weapon against me again. But going to school full-time meant I had to figure out how to pay for it entirely on my own. I was working 2 deeply demanding jobs just to keep my head above water. By day, I was a campus library assistant, organizing heavy textbooks and logging long study hours. By night, I wore a terribly stained uniform and served greasy food at a 24-hour diner just off the interstate highway. I survived on stale black coffee, leftover diner toast, and exactly 4 hours of sleep a night. Every single dollar I earned went directly into a small savings account I had opened the exact day I turned 18. I guarded that bank account with my absolute life. I was chronically exhausted, my feet constantly ached from standing all day, and I had absolutely no social life to speak of, but I was genuinely happy. I was finally building something that belonged exclusively to me. By the spring semester of my sophomore year, I had finally saved up enough money to take the next massive step in my adult life. Mr. Caldwell was getting much older, and while he never once asked me to leave his home, I knew it was time for me to stand entirely on my own 2 feet. I wanted my own private space. I scoured the local listings and found a small, slightly rundown but perfectly safe 1-bedroom apartment near the university campus. It had decent sunlight, a tiny kitchen where I could actually cook meals without the constant fear of being yelled at, and a heavy front door with a deadbolt that I would hold the absolute only key to. It represented everything I had fought so incredibly hard for over the last 3 years. It represented total, undisputed freedom. Along with the apartment, I also needed to secure a modest private student loan to cover the final 2 years of my accounting degree, as my diner tips were simply no longer enough to cover the rapidly rising tuition costs. I felt incredibly responsible and intensely proud as I carefully scheduled my financial appointments. I walked into the local real estate leasing office on a bright Tuesday morning wearing my absolute best thrifted professional blazer. I confidently handed the leasing manager my thick manila folder containing 3 full years of solid pay stubs, my detailed bank statements showing my meticulous savings habits, and a beautifully written letter of personal recommendation from Mr. Caldwell. I sat in the hard plastic chair across from her wooden desk, practically vibrating with nervous excitement. I was entirely ready to sign the lease. I was ready to finally hold the physical keys to my very own independent life. The leasing agent, a kind-looking woman with soft graying hair, smiled warmly as she took my folder and began rapidly typing my personal information into her computer system to run the standard background and credit check. I watched her glowing screen, patiently expecting a remarkably quick approval. After all, I had 0 actual debt. I paid my cheap prepaid phone bill in cash every month. I had never even owned a traditional credit card. But as the long seconds ticked by, the warm, friendly smile slowly vanished entirely from the leasing agent's face. Her brow furrowed into a deep, dark line of absolute, utter confusion. She aggressively clicked her computer mouse a few times, leaned much closer to the monitor, and then looked up at me with an expression of deep, crushing pity and extreme discomfort. "Haley," she said softly, her voice carrying a heavy tone of sincere apology. "I am so incredibly sorry, but there must be some kind of massive catastrophic mistake here in the system. Our software just instantly rejected your rental application." I blinked rapidly, completely confused by her words. A mistake? What kind of mistake could there possibly be? I have plenty of money saved up in my bank account to easily cover the security deposit and the first 3 months of rent in advance. She sighed heavily, shaking her head as she slowly turned the large computer monitor around so I could clearly see the screen for myself. "It is not your savings account, Haley. It is your official credit score, or rather, the total absolute destruction of it." I stared blankly at the complex numbers on the screen. A massive, bright red warning banner flashed repeatedly across the top of the generated credit report. My personal credit score was completely and utterly obliterated. It was sitting in the very low 400s, a number so catastrophically bad, it practically flagged me as a severe financial liability to every single institution in the entire country. The agent pointed a plastic pen at a long detailed list of active accounts permanently attached to my social security number. According to this federal report, you have 3 massive platinum credit card accounts completely maxed out and severely delinquent for months. There is a defaulted luxury auto loan from 2 years ago, and it looks like there are multiple utility accounts currently sitting in active aggressive collections. I felt all the oxygen violently leave my lungs. The small, cramped leasing office began to spin rapidly around me. The high-pitched ringing in my ears was so incredibly loud, it completely drowned out the low hum of the ceiling air conditioner. "What are you talking about?" I choked out, my voice trembling so violently I barely recognized it. "I do not even own a car. I take the city bus everywhere. I have never applied for a single credit card in my entire life. I only use hard cash and a basic checking debit card." The leasing agent looked at me with deep, profound sorrow. "Well, somebody definitely did, Haley. And they used your exact legal name and your specific private social security number to do it. You are legally, personally responsible for over $60,000 in defaulted consumer debt. You absolutely cannot rent this apartment or any apartment. Honestly, with a score this incredibly low, you will not even be able to get a basic cell phone contract without paying a massive non-refundable security deposit." I stumbled blindly out of the leasing office and immediately ran 3 full blocks down the busy city street to the local bank branch where I had scheduled my student loan appointment. I burst through the heavy glass doors, my lungs burning for air, and practically begged the bank loan officer to pull my official financial file. 10 agonizing minutes later, I was sitting in another cold, sterile office, hearing the exact same terrifying story all over again. The bank officer looked deeply at my file, shook his head in disbelief, and handed me a thick printed packet containing my full comprehensive credit history. He told me that not only was I completely flatly denied for the private student loan, but my financial identity was so deeply and thoroughly compromised that I would likely spend the next entire decade of my life simply trying to fix the massive damage. I took the thick, heavy stack of papers and walked blindly out of the bank and into the bright sunlight. I found a small, dirty concrete bench at a nearby city bus stop and collapsed heavily onto it. My hands were shaking so incredibly hard I could barely open the paper folder. I started frantically flipping through the dense pages of my completely ruined financial life, and then I finally saw it. The specific billing addresses tied to the severely delinquent accounts. The alternative contact phone numbers listed on the defaulted luxury loans. They were not random generated strings of numbers. They were not the sophisticated work of some anonymous identity thief operating out of a distant foreign country. The primary billing address, clearly listed on the $50,000 defaulted auto loan, was the exact street address of my childhood suburban home. The emergency contact phone number, permanently attached to the 3 maxed-out platinum credit cards, was my father's personal cell phone number. The scattered puzzle pieces violently and perfectly clicked into place. The sickening, absolutely catastrophic realization washed over my body like a massive wave of freezing ice water. My parents had not just framed me for stealing Jessica's wedding fund to cover up a simple momentary mistake. The dark rabbit hole went so much deeper than a single missing $40,000 bank transfer. They had been actively and maliciously stealing my financial identity for years. They had weaponized my clean slate to entirely fund their lavish fake lifestyle, buying expensive cars and charging luxury vacations while I scrubbed their kitchen floors and wore cheap, thrifted clothes. They had secretly saddled me with a massive mountain of highly toxic debt, completely destroying my entire future before I was even legally old enough to vote. The central conflict in my life instantly mutated into something much darker. It was no longer just about emotional family abandonment or being the tragic, invisible scapegoat at a holiday dinner. This was cold, calculated, deeply malicious financial sabotage. They had literally stolen my good name, ruined my hard-earned credibility, and left me completely holding the bag for their own criminal extravagance. I sat alone on that cold concrete bench, holding the absolute undeniable proof of their ultimate betrayal. But this time, I did not cry a single tear. 3 years ago, I was a terrified, helpless 17-year-old girl who let them push her out into the winter snow. Now I was a 20-year-old woman relentlessly studying accounting, physically holding a thick stack of complex financial documents, and I finally understood exactly how to read every single number. I walked back to Mr. Caldwell's house with a singular burning focus. I did not shed another tear. The paralyzing shock that had gripped me outside the leasing office was rapidly burning away, entirely replaced by a cold, meticulous rage. I was an accounting student. I spent 80 hours a week staring at complex ledgers, balancing intricate spreadsheets, and learning exactly how money moved through hidden systems. My parents had made a massive, catastrophic miscalculation. They assumed I was still the terrified 17-year-old girl who did not understand how a bank transfer worked. They had no idea they had just handed a completely ruined financial profile to a trained forensic auditor in the making. I cleared out the small guest bedroom and turned it into a war room. I bought thick binders, highlighters, and a massive corkboard. The first thing I did was exercise my federal right to request every single page of my historical credit data from all 3 major reporting bureaus. I did not just want the basic summary. I demanded the raw data. I wanted the original application dates, the original signatures, the routing numbers, and the specific addresses used to open every single account attached to my social security number. It took 3 agonizing weeks for the massive boxes of requested documents to finally arrive in the mail. When they did, I locked myself in the guest room and spread thousands of pages across the hardwood floor. I started at the very bottom of the massive pile, determined to find the exact chronological beginning of my financial destruction. I expected the fraud to start somewhere around my late teenage years. I assumed they started stealing from me when I was old enough to theoretically need a credit card. But as I traced the oldest delinquent account back to its absolute origin date, my blood ran completely cold. The very first fraudulent credit card opened in my name was not from when I was 16. It was from the year 2005. I stared at the date printed on the original application document, 2005. I was exactly 10 years old. A 10-year-old child in the 5th grade, worried about spelling tests and riding my bicycle, while my parents were actively forging my signature on federal financial documents. The application was for a high-limit platinum travel card. The secondary authorized user listed on the account was my mother, Susan Jenkins. I sat on the floor physically sick to my stomach as I read through the monthly statements from that specific year. While I was sitting in my childhood bedroom wearing hand-me-down clothes, my parents were using a credit card legally tied to my 10-year-old identity to fund lavish vacations to the Bahamas, expensive country club dinners, and thousands of dollars in designer clothing for Jessica. But why would wealthy suburban parents need to steal their 10-year-old daughter's identity? I dug deeper into public court records and county filings, cross-referencing their names with the dates of the initial fraudulent accounts. It took me 12 uninterrupted hours of relentless digging, but I finally uncovered the massive dark secret they had spent a decade desperately trying to hide. 2 months before they opened that first credit card in my name, Richard and Susan Jenkins had quietly filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. Their booming business had taken a massive hit, and they were entirely drowning in toxic debt. Instead of downsizing their lavish lifestyle, instead of selling the massive suburban house or pulling Jessica out of her outrageously expensive private schools, they decided to completely destroy my future. They needed a pristine, untouched social security number to open fresh lines of credit, and I was the perfect, unsuspecting target living right under their own roof. From the time I was 10 years old, they meticulously built a shadow economy entirely resting on my legal identity. I was their secret financial shield. When one card maxed out, they simply opened another in my name. When a luxury car lease was denied under my father's ruined credit, he fraudulently financed it using my social security number. For 7 straight years, they lived like absolute royalty while secretly digging a $60,000 grave with my name explicitly carved into the headstone. Once I fully understood the massive scope of the identity theft, I immediately turned my intense focus to the single most traumatic event of my entire life. The Christmas Eve dinner, the $40,000 I was accused of stealing from Jessica. The bank statements my father had aggressively slammed onto my dinner plate had haunted my nightmares for 3 long years. I needed to know exactly how he had fabricated them. Or worse, I needed to know if they were actually real. Armed with my newly acquired legal documents, I drafted a formal dispute to the primary bank, threatening immediate legal action for allowing fraudulent custodial transfers. Because of the massive federal fraud flags now permanently attached to my name, the bank's legal department was forced to immediately comply and release the complete unredacted transaction history of the joint account in question. 2 weeks later, a thick manila envelope arrived. I sat at my small desk and opened it with shaking hands. I pulled out the detailed transaction logs from December 2012. I tracked the exact $40,000 my father claimed I had maliciously stolen from my sister's wedding fund. And there it was. The money had indeed been transferred out of the joint family account. It had been moved in a series of highly calculated wire transfers over a period of 3 days. And my father was entirely correct about one single detail. The destination account was absolutely registered in my legal name. But here is the massive, devastating twist that my parents never intended for me to discover. The account in my name was not a savings account I had secretly opened. It was a completely fraudulent checking account my father had created using my stolen identity just 4 weeks prior to the Christmas Eve dinner. He had deliberately moved the $40,000 into this fake account to create an undeniable, legally binding paper trail that pointed directly to me. But the money did not stay there. My father only used my fraudulent account as a temporary holding cell. He used me as a financial pass-through to completely wash the money. I followed the digital paper trail as it moved the funds directly out of my fake account and into a series of highly obscure destination accounts. I spent 3 sleepless nights tracing the complex routing numbers, matching them against public business registries and obscure shell companies. When I finally cracked the final destination of the stolen funds, I actually gasped out loud in the empty room. The $40,000 had never belonged to Jessica. There was never a wedding fund. There was never a college savings account. The money in that joint account was the very last remaining liquid cash my parents had desperately scraped together by liquidating their final, heavily mortgaged assets. And where did it go? It went directly to a series of extremely aggressive private creditors. My father was not just secretly bankrupt, he had severe illicit debts. The documents clearly showed massive wire transfers to offshore gambling platforms, high-interest private payday loans, and shady settlement firms. He had gambled away everything. He had completely drained the last remaining drops of their entire financial existence. But he could never let Jessica know that. Jessica, the beautiful golden child, was currently planning an incredibly lavish high society wedding to Marcus Sterling, a highly respected corporate attorney from a wealthy family. If Marcus or Jessica discovered that the Jenkins family was entirely broke, that the wedding fund was completely gone, and that her father was drowning in illicit gambling debt, the entire picture-perfect illusion would violently shatter. Marcus would likely call off the engagement, and my parents would lose their only remaining connection to true wealth and social status. They needed a massive, incredibly convincing distraction. They needed a reason for the money to suddenly vanish without my father having to admit he was a degenerate gambler who had bankrupted his own family. And so they looked at their quiet, invisible 17-year-old daughter, and they found their perfect sacrificial lamb. They moved the remaining $40,000 through a fraudulent account in my name to pay off his illicit debts, ensuring the paper trail stopped exactly at my feet. Then they orchestrated the massive public execution at the Christmas Eve dinner. They printed out the initial transfer statements, conveniently leaving out the final destination of the funds, and confidently presented them to 30 witnesses. They framed me for the theft of the wedding fund, so that when the money inevitably failed to materialize for the venue deposits, everyone would strictly blame the deceitful, jealous younger sister. They protected Jessica's pristine image and my father's reputation by completely destroying my life in a single night. The absolute sheer cruelty of the calculation was almost too massive to fully comprehend. They did not just throw me away because they did not love me. They threw me away because I was the final required piece in their complex financial cover-up. I sat back in my chair staring blindly at the massive wall of paper surrounding me. Every single document, every highlighted bank statement, every forged signature was another physical nail in the coffin of my childhood. For 3 years, I had carried the massive, agonizing weight of their rejection. I had spent countless nights crying into my pillow at Mr. Caldwell's house, wondering what I had done wrong, wondering why I was so fundamentally unlovable that my own mother would throw me into a blizzard. But looking at the stark, undeniable maths spread across my bedroom floor, the crushing emotional burden suddenly lifted entirely off my shoulders. It was never about love. It was never about me being a bad daughter or a difficult child. It was always strictly about the money. I was nothing more than a convenient human shield for their own catastrophic failures. The profound sense of worthlessness that had haunted me for my entire life evaporated in an instant, replaced by a cold, calculating, and incredibly dangerous clarity. I slowly stood up and walked over to the large corkboard leaning against the wall. I took a thick red marker and began drawing hard lines connecting my father's gambling debts to the fraudulent credit applications. I pinned the original Chapter 7 bankruptcy filing right next to the Christmas Eve bank statements. I was no longer a terrified victim, desperately seeking their elusive approval. I was a highly motivated forensic auditor staring directly at a massive open and shut case of federal identity theft, bank fraud, and criminal conspiracy. They had stolen my past, but there was absolutely no way in hell I was going to let them keep my future. My ruined credit score was no longer a source of immense shame. It was my absolute greatest weapon. It was the undeniable physical proof of their crimes. I knew exactly what I had to do next. I could not just confront them emotionally. Emotional confrontations were exactly how they won. They thrived in chaos manipulation and loud theatrical arguments. If I walked up to them and screamed about the fraud, they would simply gaslight me, deny everything, and spin a new lie to make me look completely insane. No, I needed to dismantle their entire lives with the exact same cold, ruthless precision they had used to dismantle mine. I needed to build an absolute fortress of irrefutable legal evidence. I spent the next 4 weeks meticulously compiling every single piece of data into perfectly organized binders. I created detailed spreadsheets tracking every stolen dollar, every forged document, and every specific violation of federal law. I cross-referenced the fraudulent activity with the exact dates I was a minor, highlighting the legal impossibility of my involvement. I was not just preparing to clear my own name. I was actively preparing a federal indictment against my own parents. I knew that taking this to the police required overwhelming, undeniable proof, so I made sure every single claim was backed by 3 separate pieces of bank-verified evidence. But I also knew I could not execute this massive counterattack entirely on my own. I needed someone on the inside. I needed someone who understood the complex legal landscape and possessed the exact same quiet, observant ruthlessness that I did. I looked down at my small desk. Sitting right next to my computer keyboard, perfectly preserved after 3 long years, was the crisp white business card that had been slipped into my cheap black cardigan on that freezing Christmas Eve. The gold embossed letters gleamed slightly in the desk lamplight. Marcus Sterling, corporate attorney. I picked up the card, feeling the thick, heavy paper between my fingers. Marcus had seen the truth before anyone else. He had recognized the massive logical flaws in their story on day one. And now I had the exact physical evidence to prove he was absolutely right. It was time to make the phone call that would finally burn the Jenkins family illusion completely to the ground. 9 years is a long time to patiently sharpen a knife. I was now 29 years old and sitting in a high-rise corner office overlooking the Chicago skyline. I was a senior corporate auditor for one of the most ruthless accounting firms in the entire country. My professional life was completely dedicated to walking into massive corporate headquarters, politely shaking hands with arrogant executives, and systematically dismantling their complex financial lies. I was incredibly good at my job because I had learned the dark art of deception from the absolute worst people imaginable. But while I was busy bringing down corrupt corporate officers and exposing massive embezzlement rings, I never once forgot the primary target I was ultimately preparing for. In the bottom drawer of my heavy mahogany desk, completely locked away from the rest of the world, sat 3 incredibly thick red binders. They contained 9 years of meticulously verified financial data, legally binding affidavits, and the complete documented history of my parents' massive federal fraud. Over the years, I had silently monitored their slow but highly inevitable financial decay from a very safe distance. I watched through public county records as they narrowly avoided foreclosure, repeatedly refinanced their home at toxic predatory interest rates, and continued to desperately float their fake wealthy lifestyle on a rapidly crumbling foundation of lies. But I did not strike. I waited. I knew that jumping the gun without absolute overwhelming legal firepower would only give them a small window to escape. I needed a completely watertight case. More importantly, I needed the absolute right legal hammer to smash through their final remaining defenses. I reached into my tailored blazer pocket and pulled out the crisp white business card that had lived safely in my wallet for almost a decade. Marcus Sterling, corporate attorney. I had kept quiet tabs on him as well over the years. He was now a senior partner at his incredibly prestigious downtown firm, a man widely known for his absolutely devastating courtroom presence and his flawless aggressive legal strategy. I picked up my office phone and dialed his private direct line. The line rang exactly twice before a deep, immediately recognizable voice answered. I took a slow, steady breath and spoke perfectly clearly. "Marcus, this is Haley Jenkins. I need a meeting with you today." There was a long, heavy pause on the other end of the line. For a fleeting second, I honestly thought he might just hang up on me. Instead, he simply asked where I was located and told me to meet him at a highly private upscale steakhouse downtown in exactly 1 hour. When I walked into the dimly lit restaurant, I spotted him immediately sitting alone in a quiet corner booth. He looked older, his sharp, handsome features hardened by time and intense stress, and there was a deep, profound exhaustion resting heavily in his observant eyes. He stood up slowly as I approached his table, his sharp gaze sweeping over my expensive tailored suit, my confident, upright posture, and the incredibly heavy leather briefcase securely fastened in my right hand. He offered a tight, knowing smile. "You look like a woman who is completely ready to go to full-scale war," he said quietly as I slid gracefully into the dark leather booth across from him. I looked directly into his tired eyes and told him I was not just ready for war. I was absolutely ready to drop a complete nuclear bomb on my parents. But before I could even open my heavy briefcase, Marcus held up his large hand and signaled the waiter to bring him a double bourbon. He looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust, an anger not directed at me, but at the very mention of my family name. He took a slow, heavy drink from his glass and let out a harsh, bitter laugh. He told me that I was not the only one actively trying to permanently destroy the Jenkins family illusion. For the past 18 exhausting months, Marcus had been locked in a brutal, highly toxic, and incredibly vicious divorce battle with my older sister, Jessica. The beautiful, flawless golden child had finally let her fake mask slip completely off her face. He told me how Jessica had spent the last several years secretly draining their joint bank accounts, opening massive hidden credit lines completely behind his back, and recklessly jeopardizing his extremely hard-earned legal career just to fund her insatiable, endless need for high society status. She was exactly like our parents. She was a deeply manipulative narcissist who firmly believed the actual rules of society simply did not apply to her. Marcus revealed that Jessica had recently attempted to file a massive barrage of entirely false domestic allegations against him in a desperate sociopathic bid to gain full primary custody of their 2 young children and publicly demand a massive, completely unjustified monthly alimony settlement. She was actively trying to ruin his pristine professional reputation, destroy his entire livelihood, and take his beloved children away forever. My parents, naturally, were fully supporting Jessica in this vicious, aggressive legal crusade, completely ignoring her massive financial betrayals and actively testifying on her behalf in family court to paint Marcus as the villain. Marcus was legally fighting for his absolute life, and he was doing it against the most accomplished professional liars I had ever known in my entire life. He looked at me, his strong jaw completely clenched with quiet, contained fury. He said he desperately needed leverage. He needed something so massively destructive that it would completely obliterate Jessica's false credibility in front of the stern family court judge and force my parents to immediately back down from their aggressive smear campaign. I did not say a single word. I simply reached down, popped open the heavy brass latches of my leather briefcase, and pulled out the very first thick red binder. I slid it slowly across the polished wooden table until it rested directly in front of him. I told him he did not just need simple leverage. He needed an absolute forensic financial execution. Marcus slowly opened the heavy red binder. For the next 45 intense minutes, the absolute only sound at our secluded table was the slow, methodical turning of heavy paper pages. I watched the incredibly sharp, brilliant mind of a senior corporate attorney instantly recognize the sheer massive magnitude of the federal crimes staring right back at him. I calmly walked him through every single forged financial signature, every highly fraudulent credit card application, and the exact digital paper trail of the $40,000 from that infamous freezing Christmas Eve dinner. I showed him the undeniable certified proof that our own parents had maliciously stolen my identity when I was just 10 years old, merely to hide their own highly secret Chapter 7 bankruptcy. I showed him exactly how they had systematically used the completely fraudulent accounts to entirely fund the fake affluent lifestyle that had originally convinced him to marry Jessica in the very first place. When Marcus finally reached the very last page of the thick binder, he slowly closed the heavy cover and looked up at me. The profound, deep exhaustion in his eyes was completely, totally gone. It was entirely replaced by a cold, highly calculated, and incredibly dangerous legal predatory instinct. He realized in that exact moment that the very same corrupt people currently trying to destroy his life in family court were actually actively guilty of massive, highly punishable federal felonies. He leaned across the small wooden table, his deep voice dropping to a dangerous, quiet whisper. "Haley," he said evenly, "if we officially submit these documents to the federal authorities right now, your parents will not just lose their suburban house. They will go directly to federal prison for a very long time. Are you absolutely completely prepared for that level of complete, absolute destruction?" I looked right back at him, my expression entirely carved from solid, cold stone. I told him I had spent the last 12 years of my life paying the massive, excruciating, emotional, and financial price for a terrible crime I never actually committed. I told him I had slept on cheap mattresses, worked myself to the absolute bone, and completely rebuilt my ruined, stolen identity from the very ashes they cruelly left behind. I was not just simply prepared for their total destruction. I was actively, aggressively demanding it. Marcus nodded slowly, a dark, deeply satisfied smile finally breaking across his handsome face. He reached out his large hand across the table. We formed a brilliant, purely professional, and highly tactical alliance right there in the dimly lit corner booth of that Chicago steakhouse. He firmly agreed to act as my official legal counsel, completely free of charge. With his immense, undeniable power as a senior law partner, he could legally formally subpoena the final set of certified banking records we desperately needed to completely bulletproof the federal fraud case without ever tipping off my parents. In direct exchange, I agreed to willingly testify as an expert forensic accounting witness in his highly contentious divorce trial. I would officially present the massive Jenkins family fraud directly to the judge to completely destroy Jessica's fake credibility and absolutely guarantee that Marcus successfully secured full permanent custody of his 2 young children. We were no longer just 2 silent victims of the toxic Jenkins family. We were a highly organized, heavily armed legal and financial strike team. My family had spent decades building a massive, beautiful house of cards on a completely rotten foundation of stolen money and shattered, innocent lives. They thought they were completely, entirely untouchable. They thought the quiet, invisible daughter and the polite, observant corporate son-in-law would simply roll over and silently accept their ultimate betrayals. But they had made the most fatal, massive error legally possible. They had completely underestimated our absolute relentless patience and our sheer combined intellect. Marcus and I spent the next 3 long weeks working together in complete, total, absolute secrecy. We utilized his extensive, powerful legal resources to quietly and officially subpoena the highly certified bank records directly from the massive national financial institutions. We did not send a single angry warning letter. We did not call them to threaten them with a civil lawsuit. We simply gathered the absolute, undeniable federal proof, organized it into highly devastating legal exhibits, and locked it tightly away in a heavy steel vault, quietly waiting for the absolute perfect, inevitable moment to spring our massive trap. The toxic Jenkins family was currently highly busy celebrating Jessica's temporary false victories in family court, completely entirely unaware that an absolute catastrophic hurricane was rapidly forming right off their immediate coast. They had absolutely no idea that the very same daughter they had violently, aggressively thrown out into the freezing winter snow 12 long years ago was currently standing right outside their front door, holding a massive lit match and smiling quietly as she fully prepared to burn their entire fake, pathetic empire completely to the absolute ground. 6 months passed while Marcus and I carefully positioned our invisible chess pieces. During that time, the financial reality of my parents' situation went from a slow leak to an absolute catastrophic structural collapse. With Marcus legally freezing all of his personal assets during the highly contentious divorce proceedings, Jessica suddenly lost her unlimited access to his massive bank accounts. But Jessica, being Jessica, simply refused to alter her lavish lifestyle. She still demanded expensive dinners, luxury spa treatments, and designer clothes to keep up appearances for her wealthy friends. And without Marcus to foot the bill, she turned entirely to our parents. Richard and Susan, desperate to keep their golden child happy and maintain the fragile illusion of their high society status, began draining whatever tiny remaining drops of credit they had left. They took out predatory secondary mortgages. They pawned my mother's remaining authentic jewelry. But a house of cards built on toxic debt and stolen identity can only stand for so long before gravity finally takes over. The aggressive creditors stopped calling and started physically showing up. The bank officially filed the preliminary paperwork to foreclose on the massive suburban colonial house they had prized above everything else. They were completely and utterly out of options. They had no money, no credit, and their fraudulent shadow economy was finally catching up to them. But my parents were nothing if not incredibly resourceful parasites. Through the wealthy suburban grapevine and a few desperate internet searches, they discovered a highly inconvenient truth. They learned that the quiet, invisible daughter they had violently thrown into the snow 12 years ago was not dead in a ditch somewhere. She was alive, highly successful, and incredibly wealthy. They found out I was a senior executive auditor at a massive downtown firm, making a very lucrative salary and commanding immense respect in the Chicago financial district. And in their deeply twisted minds, my hard-earned success was simply another untapped bank account waiting for them to aggressively drain. I was hosting a massive annual charity gala for my corporate firm on a crisp Friday night in early October. The event was held in the grand ballroom of one of the most exclusive luxury hotels in downtown Chicago. It was a highly sophisticated affair filled with influential chief executive officers, powerful city politicians, and the absolute elite of the corporate finance world. I was wearing a stunning tailored black evening gown, holding a crystal glass of sparkling water, and comfortably holding court with the senior partners of my firm. I felt completely in my element. I was no longer the terrified 17-year-old girl cowering in a dirty kitchen. I was a powerhouse executive who controlled the entire room with quiet, absolute confidence. The crystal chandeliers were glowing warmly, a soft jazz quartet was playing on the elevated stage, and the evening was proceeding flawlessly. Then the heavy mahogany double doors at the main entrance of the ballroom swung wide open. I was in the middle of discussing a complex corporate merger with a highly respected banking executive when I happened to glance toward the lobby. My blood immediately turned to solid ice. Walking right past the confused security guards, aggressively flashing completely fake smiles, were Richard and Susan Jenkins. I had not seen them in person for 12 long years. They looked significantly older, heavily worn down by the immense stress of their collapsing lives. My father was wearing a tuxedo that looked slightly dusty and a size too large, completely lacking his former booming confidence. My mother was wearing a dress I recognized from a decade ago, her smile tight and incredibly brittle. They did not look like the wealthy elite they so desperately pretended to be. They looked like highly desperate scavengers, searching for a lifeline. They scanned the crowded ballroom like hungry predators, their eyes frantically darting past the expensive floral arrangements and the wealthy guests. And then my mother's eyes locked directly onto me. A sudden, terrifying flash of predatory recognition crossed her face. She immediately grabbed my father's arm and pointed sharply in my direction. They started marching across the expensive imported carpet, weaving through the elegant crowd on a direct collision course toward me. My heart gave a single violent jolt against my ribs. A tiny fleeting shadow of that terrified teenage girl tried to claw its way up my throat, but I violently shoved it back down. I was not that girl anymore. I was a senior corporate auditor, and I was standing on my own highly protected territory. I did not run. I did not hide. I simply took a slow sip of my sparkling water and waited for the absolute inevitable collision. As they approached my circle of senior colleagues, my mother instantly activated her theatrical performance. She threw her arms open wide, her eyes suddenly brimming with perfectly manufactured tears. "Haley," she cried out loudly, her voice practically echoing over the soft jazz music. "Oh, my beautiful, sweet daughter, it has been so incredibly long. We have missed you so desperately." She practically threw herself at me, wrapping her thin arms tightly around my shoulders in a highly aggressive fake embrace. The heavy, overpowering smell of her signature perfume instantly flooded my senses, bringing back a sudden, sickening wave of childhood trauma. My father stepped right up behind her, placing a heavy, overly familiar hand on my bare shoulder and giving it a firm squeeze. "Look at you, Haley," he boomed, attempting to summon his old confident alpha male persona for the benefit of my wealthy colleagues. "You look absolutely incredible. We are just so incredibly proud of the amazing, successful woman you have become." My senior partners and the banking executives stopped their conversation, immediately completely taken aback by this sudden, highly emotional family reunion. They looked at me with polite confusion. I had never once mentioned my parents to anyone at the firm. I had intentionally built my entire professional reputation as a fiercely independent woman with absolutely no family ties. And now here were these two strangers loudly claiming me as their beloved daughter in the middle of a major corporate event. I did not flinch, I did not pull away violently or scream at them to leave. I calmly stepped out of my mother's suffocating embrace, keeping my face entirely neutral and composed. "Richard, Susan," I said quietly, my voice completely devoid of any warmth or familial affection. "What an unexpected surprise. How exactly did you get past the private security desk downstairs?" My father laughed loudly, a deeply forced artificial sound that grated heavily against my ears. "Oh, you know us, Haley," he chuckled, looking nervously at the confused banking executive standing next to me. "We just told the nice young man at the door that we were the proud parents of the beautiful hostess. We simply could not miss a chance to see our amazing daughter shining so brightly at such a prestigious event." My colleagues, completely unaware of the massive toxic history standing in front of them, politely smiled and introduced themselves. My parents eagerly shook their hands, immediately laying on their fake suburban charm. Susan practically gushed to the senior partners about how hard I had worked as a child, completely rewriting history to paint herself as a highly supportive, loving mother who had fostered my brilliant mind. She talked about how they had always known I was destined for absolute greatness. It was a deeply sickening, entirely nauseating performance. They were actively using my hard-earned professional colleagues as a captive audience to perfectly trap me in the role of the dutiful, loving daughter. They knew I could not simply cause a massive dramatic scene in front of the very people who controlled my lucrative career. They thought they had completely outsmarted me by ambushing me in a highly public professional setting where I was actively forced to maintain a calm, polite exterior. After a few agonizing minutes of their painful fake pleasantries, my father casually checked his watch and turned to my colleagues with a massive artificial smile. "If you gentlemen would kindly excuse us for just a brief moment," he said smoothly. "Susan and I would absolutely love to catch up with our beautiful daughter privately. It has been far too long since we had a quiet family moment." My colleagues politely nodded and stepped away to grab fresh drinks from the bar, leaving me completely alone with the two people who had actively destroyed my childhood. The absolute second my partners were out of earshot, the warm, loving masks violently slipped off their faces. The fake smiles vanished instantly, completely replaced by cold, calculating desperation. The warm, fuzzy family reunion was officially over. It was time for the aggressive extortion to begin. My mother leaned in close to me, her voice dropping to a harsh, desperate whisper. Her eyes were completely hard, frantically darting around to make sure nobody was listening. "Listen to me very carefully, Haley," she hissed, her fingers aggressively gripping my forearm. "We are completely out of time. The bank is aggressively moving to foreclose on the house this coming Monday. We are completely broke. Jessica's horrible, selfish husband has totally cut her off, and we have absolutely nothing left to save the property. We need money right now. I looked down at her hand gripping my arm and then slowly looked back up into her panicked eyes. You need money, I repeated flatly. And you actually thought the best possible strategy was to ambush me at a major corporate charity gala after 12 years of absolute total silence. My father stepped closer, using his large physical frame to actively block my view of the ballroom. His face was deeply flushed with anger and sheer panic. Do not play arrogant games with us, Haley, he growled in a low, threatening tone. We know exactly how much money you make at this fancy firm. We know you live in a massive luxury penthouse downtown. You have more than enough cash sitting in your bank accounts to easily cover the mortgage arrears. We need exactly $150,000 transferred into our primary account by tomorrow morning. I actually let out a small, quiet laugh. It was not a laugh of humor. It was a laugh of absolute sheer disbelief at the massive, towering audacity of the two people standing before me. You want me to simply hand you $150,000? After you violently threw me out into a freezing blizzard with absolutely nothing but a plastic garbage bag. After you completely disowned me in front of 30 people. My father leaned his face incredibly close to mine, his breath smelling heavily of cheap alcohol and pure desperation. You owe us, he snarled viciously. We put a roof over your head for 17 years. We fed you. We clothed you. You are going to write that a check right now, Haley, or I swear to God, I will completely ruin this little fancy party for you. I will start screaming right here in the middle of this ballroom. I will tell all your wealthy little friends and your snobby senior partners exactly what a terrible, completely ungrateful, highly selfish daughter you really are. I will make such a massive, embarrassing scene that you will never be able to show your face in the Chicago corporate world ever again. Do not test me. I have absolutely nothing left to lose. The threat was incredibly clear and deeply malicious. They were holding my pristine professional reputation entirely hostage. They honestly believed that my deep fear of public embarrassment and corporate scandal would immediately force me to submit to their aggressive financial extortion. They thought they were the ultimate predators, completely cornering their weak, helpless prey in the open. They thought I was still the terrified 17-year-old girl who would instantly fold under their loud, aggressive threats just to keep the peace. But they were entirely wrong. I did not feel a single ounce of fear. I did not feel panic. As I stood there listening to my father aggressively threaten to destroy my career, the only thing I felt was a cold, highly calculated, and immensely satisfying sense of absolute ultimate victory. They had just unknowingly walked completely willingly into the massive steel jaws of the very trap Marcus and I had spent the last month meticulously setting. They thought they were aggressively ambushing me at my own gala. They had absolutely no idea that I had been patiently waiting for them to arrive all night long. I looked at my father, studying the deep, frantic wrinkles around his eyes and the completely desperate sweat forming on his brow. I analyzed his physical posture, the exact same way I analyzed a fraudulent balance sheet. He was completely over-leveraged. He was bluffing with absolutely no actual cards left in his hand. He honestly believed that the threat of a loud social scene was a massive trump card, because social standing was the absolute only currency he had ever actually valued in his entire life. He completely failed to understand that I had built my entire successful career on my undeniable competence, my relentless hard work, and my highly proven ability to ruthlessly handle massive corporate crises. A screaming temper tantrum from an estranged, desperate relative in a hotel ballroom would not destroy my career. It would only make my senior partners immediately call hotel security. But I did not point that out to him. I did not explain how completely pathetic and entirely toothless his aggressive threats actually were. I needed him to stay fully committed to his massive bluff. I needed him to believe that he had me completely cornered right up until the exact second I violently pulled the rug entirely out from under his feet. Susan was practically shaking with aggressive energy, digging her fingernails painfully into my arm. "Are you listening to us, Haley?" she demanded quietly. "You are going to quietly walk out to the lobby right now, pull out your phone, and authorize the massive wire transfer. or your father is going to start flipping these expensive tables and screaming your dark secrets to the entire corporate world. Do not make us ruin your little fake successful life. I took a very slow, highly deliberate breath. I looked from my aggressively panicked mother to my fiercely threatening father. I let a perfectly measured look of mild defeat slowly cross my face. I intentionally dropped my shoulders just a fraction of an inch, perfectly mimicking the defeated, terrified posture of the 17-year-old girl they so confidently remembered breaking. "Okay," I whispered quietly, making sure my voice sounded suitably shaken and entirely compliant. "Okay, please do not make a massive scene here. This charity gala is incredibly important to my firm. Please do not yell. I will give you the money you want. I will help you save the house." The immediate massive wave of pure, absolute relief that violently washed over their faces was entirely sickening to witness. My father's aggressive posture instantly relaxed, and a highly triumphant, deeply arrogant smirk quickly spread across his sweaty face. He looked at my mother and gave her a small victorious nod. They had won. They had successfully bullied the quiet, invisible scapegoat into completely funding their toxic, fraudulent lifestyle one more time. They truly believed they had just successfully executed the ultimate financial shakedown. My mother instantly let go of my arm, patting my shoulder with a massive, fake, affectionate smile. "I knew you would finally see reason, Haley," she cooed sickeningly. "Deep down, you are still a good, dutiful daughter who truly understands the absolute importance of supporting her family in times of crisis. Now please, hurry up and make the transfer. We have a very long drive back to the suburbs tonight." I took a small, deliberate step backward, creating a strict physical boundary between myself and their toxic presence. I smoothed down the expensive, dark fabric of my evening gown and looked at them with a completely blank, highly unreadable expression. "I am not going to authorize a massive wire transfer standing out in the middle of a crowded, noisy hotel lobby," I stated firmly. "The banking security protocols for a transfer of $150,000 require strict verbal authentication and a highly secure private connection. If you want this money right now, we need to go somewhere completely quiet and absolutely private to finalize the transaction." My father rolled his eyes impatiently, but quickly nodded his aggressive agreement. "Fine," he snapped abruptly. "Where do we go? Just lead the way and do not try anything stupid. I am watching you very closely." I turned my back to them and began walking slowly toward the far end of the grand ballroom, navigating smoothly past the wealthy guests and the massive floral arrangements. They followed closely, right on my heels, like two desperate, starving dogs tightly tailing a fresh meal. They were so completely blinded by their absolute desperate greed and their highly arrogant assumption of total control that they completely failed to notice the exact direction I was actively leading them. I was not leading them to a quiet corner of the lobby. I was not leading them toward the hotel exit. I was walking them directly toward a set of heavy, soundproof double doors tucked away behind the main stage area. It was a private, VIP conference room I had specifically reserved for the entire evening under my own highly secure corporate account. I reached out and firmly grasped the heavy brass handle of the conference room door. I did not look back at my parents. I just smoothly pushed the heavy door open and confidently stepped inside the brightly lit room, leaving the loud jazz music and the crowded charity gala completely behind. My parents eagerly rushed inside right behind me, their eyes completely wide with greedy anticipation of the massive payout they firmly believed was only seconds away. They were completely, entirely ready to aggressively finalize the financial extortion and secure their massive unearned prize. They never once suspected that they were actively stepping directly into the absolute final stage of their own complete total destruction. The heavy soundproof door clicked shut softly behind us, shutting out the soft jazz music and the loud, crowded chatter of the charity gala completely. The private, VIP conference room was intensely quiet and brightly lit, with modern, expensive overhead fixtures casting a harsh, unforgiving light across the long, polished mahogany table sitting right in the center of the room. My parents walked in eagerly, right behind me, their eyes immediately scanning the luxurious space for a sleek laptop or a corporate checkbook, fully assuming I was about to log into my secure banking portal to immediately transfer their requested money. They were practically vibrating with pure greedy anticipation, completely confident that their aggressive public ambush had perfectly succeeded. But the room was not empty. Sitting perfectly still at the very far end of the long mahogany table was Marcus Sterling. He was wearing a flawless dark charcoal-tailored suit, his broad shoulders completely relaxed, his large hands resting calmly on top of a massive thick red binder. He did not look angry or surprised. He looked entirely predatory, like a deeply patient hunter simply waiting for the oblivious prey to completely walk into the steel trap. The absolute instant my father registered Marcus sitting there, his confident, aggressive stride faltered entirely. He physically stumbled over his own feet, stopping dead in his tracks, as if he had just walked directly into a solid brick wall. My mother gasped audibly, taking a rapid, terrified step backward and practically colliding with the heavy wooden door we had just walked through. They knew exactly who Marcus was. They knew he was the brilliant, highly ruthless corporate attorney, currently locked in a brutal, vicious legal war with their precious golden child, Jessica. And seeing him sitting calmly in my private VIP room at my corporate charity gala completely entirely shattered their fragile, arrogant reality in a tiny fraction of a second. The complete, absolute silence in the room was deafening. You could practically hear the arrogant blood draining completely out of my parents' faces, leaving them looking incredibly pale and suddenly deeply terrified. "What is this, Haley?" My father finally demanded, his voice suddenly terribly weak and completely trembling, losing absolutely all of its former aggressive, booming confidence. "Why is he here? What kind of sick, disgusting joke are you playing on us?" I did not answer him immediately. I wanted to let the pure, absolute terror fully settle into their bones. I walked slowly over to the mahogany table, taking my absolute time, and pulled out the heavy leather executive chair positioned right next to Marcus. I sat down, deliberately smoothing the expensive dark silk fabric of my evening gown and folded my hands neatly on top of the cold, polished wood. Marcus did not say a single word. He did not need to. His mere massive physical presence was an undeniable legal threat. He simply reached out with one large hand and slowly, smoothly slid the massive, thick red binder directly across the smooth table until it rested perfectly centered between my terrified parents and us. "Sit down, Richard," I said, my voice dropping entirely to a low, chilling, and entirely commanding register that I reserved exclusively for extremely hostile corporate audits. "You aggressively demanded a private meeting to thoroughly discuss my personal finances. We are currently having a private meeting. Sit down right now." My mother looked frantically at the locked, heavy wooden door behind her and then back at the massive, terrifying red binder sitting on the table. Her breathing was rapidly becoming shallow and panicked. "Haley, please," she stammered, her completely fake maternal warmth entirely gone, replaced by raw, pathetic animal panic. "We just came here for a simple private family loan. We absolutely do not want to be involved in whatever dark legal games you are currently playing with Jessica's terrible husband. Please, just simply do the bank wire transfer right now so we can quickly leave and go back to the suburbs." I leaned forward, resting my elbows heavily on the cold dark wood of the table, my eyes locking entirely onto hers with absolutely zero mercy. "There is absolutely no wire transfer, Susan," I stated completely flatly. "There is absolutely no emergency family loan. There never, ever was. You did not aggressively walk into this private room to successfully extort $150,000 from your terrified, invisible teenage daughter. You walked entirely willingly into this room to finally permanently answer for 12 solid years of massive, highly coordinated, federally punishable financial crimes. Sit down in those chairs right now, or Marcus will immediately make one single swift phone call to the Chicago Police Department and have you both aggressively arrested for attempted financial extortion, right in the very middle of this massive, crowded hotel lobby." The direct, explicit threat of public police arrest was the absolute only language they genuinely entirely understood. Their knees practically gave out completely as they stumbled awkwardly forward and collapsed incredibly heavily into the dark leather chairs positioned on the exact opposite side of the mahogany table. They looked absolutely entirely terrified, staring down at the thick red binder like it was a highly active live explosive device, just waiting to completely detonate and destroy their entire fake lives. I reached out and slowly, deliberately flipped open the heavy red cover. The very first page staring right back at them was not a simple bank statement or a basic credit report. It was a formal, highly detailed criminal fraud report officially filed with the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division and heavily cross-referenced with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The official government agency seals were printed incredibly brightly at the very top of the crisp white pages. I took my index finger and slowly slid the heavy stapled packet across the table, stopping it exactly right in front of my sweating father's. Graying face, "Read it," I commanded incredibly quietly. "Look at exactly what you did to me." My father stared blindly down at the federal government documents, his hands shaking so violently he could not even attempt to pick up the paper. His face completely, entirely drained of all remaining color, turning a deeply sickly ashen gray. I did not wait for his pathetic response. I launched immediately into the exact flawless forensic presentation I had spent the last 6 grueling months meticulously preparing. I told them that I knew absolutely everything. I did not just have a simple dark suspicion. I had the absolute, undeniable, highly certified physical proof permanently locked away in a highly secure federal legal database. I started exactly where their entire massive, disgusting lie first began. I reached into the binder and pulled out the original certified Chapter 7 bankruptcy filing from the year 2005. I placed it perfectly directly on top of the federal fraud report. I looked right deeply into my mother's completely terrified wide eyes and told her I knew exactly what happened when I was only 10 years old. I told her I knew their suburban business was completely failing rapidly and they were entirely drowning in highly toxic, massive debt. But instead of actively facing the harsh reality of their complete total financial failure, they decided to maliciously use my pristine, untouched, minor social security number to successfully open a massive platinum travel credit card. I aggressively pulled out the next massive stack of documents from the binder. They were the original certified credit applications pulled directly from a dozen different major national financial institutions. Do you honestly truly think a 10-year-old child can legally authorize a platinum line of corporate credit? I asked, my voice echoing harshly in the incredibly quiet room. Do you honestly think I did not immediately notice that the secondary authorized user permanently explicitly listed on every single fraudulent account was Susan Jenkins? I successfully tracked every single stolen penny. I did not just briefly look at the massive default balances on my ruined credit report. I am a senior corporate forensic auditor. I pulled the exact, incredibly detailed transactional data for 7 consecutive straight years. I showed them the highly detailed, complex spreadsheets I had personally built. I pointed sharply to the exact specific dates and the exact specific dollar amounts. Here is the massive financial charge for the luxury oceanfront resort in the Bahamas, I said, tapping a very sharp fingernail aggressively against a specific highlighted line of numerical data. Here is the highly expensive designer diamond jewelry you specifically bought Jessica for her lavish Sweet 16 birthday party. Here is the massive unearned down payment for the luxury leased vehicle you proudly drove around the wealthy suburbs to aggressively pretend you are still financially relevant to your country club friends. You actively, successfully paid for your entire fake, pathetic, affluent lifestyle using massive high-interest credit cards, legally tied entirely to a terrified child who was wearing cheap hand-me-down clothes and silently scrubbing your dirty kitchen floors every single night. I looked directly at my father, who was now sweating completely profusely, aggressively gripping the exact edge of the mahogany table like he was physically falling off a massive steep cliff. I painstakingly tracked the explicitly forged signatures Richard Versey said completely coldly. I actively, officially hired an independent certified forensic handwriting expert. I had them specifically, deeply analyze the signatures permanently placed on the highly fraudulent auto loans and the massive predatory personal loans you secretly took out. They officially, legally concluded with absolute, total, undeniable certainty that the fake signatures perfectly, completely, exactly matched your exact specific handwriting. It is a completely open and shut massive case of highly aggravated federal identity theft and severe bank fraud. You left an incredibly sloppy, extremely massive physical paper trail spanning an entire decade because you were completely, incredibly arrogant and you honestly deeply believed I was way too stupid to ever figure it out. They were completely, entirely paralyzed. They could not physically speak. They could not even begin to attempt to deny the massive accusations because the sheer overwhelming massive volume of the highly certified physical evidence sitting right in front of them was entirely, completely undeniable. But I was absolutely not finished with them yet. I had specifically saved the absolute most deeply devastating piece of physical evidence for the very end of the total confrontation. I reached deep into the very back of the thick red binder and smoothly pulled out a single thin brown manila folder. I opened it carefully and laid 3 specific, highly certified bank statements side by side, exactly perfectly on the polished table. I looked directly straight at my terrified father, my eyes entirely, completely, utterly cold and absolutely devoid of any human empathy. Now I said incredibly softly, "Let us talk specifically about Christmas Eve. 2012. Let us talk deeply about the exactly $40,000 you so loudly and confidently explicitly accused me of maliciously stealing from Jessica's precious imaginary wedding fund." My father immediately let out a very quiet, deeply desperate, pathetic whimpering sound, his eyes aggressively darting frantically toward the locked, heavy wooden door, as if contemplating a massive, desperate run for his absolute life. I told him I had formally aggressively threatened the primary banking institution with a massive, highly destructive federal lawsuit for explicitly allowing an illegal, completely blind custodial transfer. I told him the massive bank immediately completely caved to the severe legal pressure and quickly provided the complete, entirely unredacted, highly certified transaction history of the exact joint family account in question. I tapped the very first bank statement with my finger. "Here is the exact $40,000 permanently leaving the joint family account," I said calmly. I immediately tapped the second paper statement. "Here is the highly fraudulent, completely fake checking account you secretly illegally opened in my exact legal name just exactly 4 short weeks prior to the massive holiday dinner, completely explicitly, actively designed to serve strictly as a temporary financial holding cell to perfectly permanently frame me for the massive crime." And then I slowly, deliberately tapped the third and final certified bank statement. "And right here, Richard," I whispered loudly, my voice completely dripping with absolute highly toxic venom, "is the exact absolute final destination of the stolen $40,000. The massive amount of money did not stay resting in my fake checking account. You immediately swiftly transferred every single penny of it to a highly complex series of highly obscured, offshore illegal gambling platforms and extremely aggressive, deeply shady private payday loan companies to quickly, actively pay off your massive, completely illicit, secret gambling debts. You were completely, entirely broke. On that freezing Christmas Eve, you had aggressively gambled away the very last tiny remaining drop of your entire liquid financial existence. And instead of acting like a real man and simply telling your precious, beautiful golden child that her lavish wedding fund was entirely, completely gone, you deliberately, violently orchestrated a massive, incredibly public execution to completely, entirely destroy my entire young life and permanently frame me exactly for your own highly pathetic, utterly disgusting, massive financial crimes. I leaned incredibly close across the mahogany table, my face mere inches away from his sweating, utterly defeated expression. "I meticulously, successfully tracked every single penny, Richard," I repeated softly. "Every single forged signature, every single fraudulent credit application, and every single massive, terrible lie you ever told to actively destroy my complete existence." I stared entirely, completely, deeply into their horrified, wide-open eyes, letting the absolute, total, massive crushing weight of their ultimate, complete, total, catastrophic, absolute destruction finally, fully, completely settle, permanently, entirely into their absolute, deeply dark, thoroughly corrupt, incredibly, truly pathetic souls. The absolute silence in the VIP conference room was no longer just heavy. It was a physical, suffocating entity that pressed violently against the walls. My parents sat completely frozen in their dark leather chairs, staring at the highly certified banking documents I had just spread across the polished mahogany table. The complete and total collapse of their arrogant 12-year lie was currently happening right in front of my eyes, in agonizingly slow motion. My father, Richard, seemed to physically shrink inside his cheap, dusty tuxedo. The aggressive, booming alpha male persona he had used to terrorize me for my entire childhood completely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, pathetic old man who suddenly realized he was trapped in a highly secure cage with the very predator he had created. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a dry, rasping sound emerged. He was completely out of breath, as if he had just run a massive marathon. My mother, Susan, however, reacted exactly the way she always reacted when completely backed into a highly dangerous corner. She instantly, aggressively deployed her weaponized tears. Her face crumpled into a mask of pure manufactured agony, and she let out a loud theatrical sob that echoed sharply in the quiet, soundproof room. She reached her shaking hands across the cold wooden table, desperately trying to grab my fingers, but I smoothly pulled my hands back out of her reach. "Haley, my sweet baby crazy girl," she wailed, her voice trembling with intense fake emotion. "Please, you absolutely must understand why we did this. We were so incredibly desperate. Your father was entirely drowning in massive, terrible debts, and we were about to lose everything we had ever built. We only used your name because we wanted to keep a roof over your head. We wanted to protect our beautiful family. We never, ever meant to truly hurt you. It was only supposed to be a highly temporary solution. You are our daughter, and family simply has to make incredibly hard sacrifices for each other." I stared at her crying face, feeling absolutely nothing but a deep, profound, freezing disgust. I did not yell at her. I kept my voice entirely, completely flat and totally devoid of any human empathy. "You did not use my name to put a roof over my head, Susan," I stated quietly. "You specifically used my stolen identity to actively fund expensive luxury vacations to the Bahamas and buy diamond jewelry for Jessica while I wore torn cheap clothing and cooked your massive holiday meals. You aggressively, explicitly destroyed my entire financial future when I was only 10 years old simply because you could not bear the terrible embarrassment of telling your wealthy country club friends that you were actually completely broke. And when your illicit gambling debts finally caught up with you on Christmas Eve, you deliberately framed me for a massive federal crime and threw me out into a freezing winter blizzard with a plastic garbage bag. Do not ever sit there and aggressively attempt to tell me you did any of this for family. You did it entirely for yourselves. You are a deeply selfish, highly toxic coward." My mother's fake theatrical sobbing abruptly stopped entirely. She realized instantly that the emotional maternal manipulation tactic that had perfectly controlled me for 17 years was now completely, utterly useless. She wiped her dry eyes and looked frantically at my father, demanding him to somehow fix this massive, catastrophic situation. Richard was sweating profusely, aggressively wiping his wet forehead with the sleeve of his tuxedo jacket. His frantic, panicked brain was desperately trying to pivot to the only other language he knew, which was aggressive corporate bargaining. He leaned forward, gripping the edge of the table, his eyes pleading directly with me. "Okay, Haley," he stammered, his voice shaking violently. "Okay, you win. You are completely right. We made a massive, terrible mistake, but we can fix this right now, strictly as a family. We can treat this exactly like a private business arrangement. Just tell me exactly how much money we took in your name. We will slowly pay you back every single penny. I will secretly get a second job. We will actively sign whatever legal promissory note you want. Just please gather up all these terrible federal documents and throw them in the trash. You do not need to actively involve the police or the federal government. We can easily settle this quietly, right here in this room, just between the three of us." A low, deep rumbling sound suddenly broke the tense silence. It took me a fraction of a second to realize that Marcus Sterling was actually laughing. It was not a warm, happy laugh. It was a cold, highly predatory sound that sent violent, visible shivers directly down my parents' spines. Marcus slowly leaned forward, resting his massive forearms on the mahogany table, completely dominating the physical space of the room. He looked at my father with an expression of pure, unadulterated professional disgust. "Richard," he said, his deep, resonant voice echoing powerfully in the room, "you truly are incredibly, deeply stupid. You honestly believe this is a simple civil dispute about unpaid personal loans. You honestly think you can just quietly sign a piece of paper and slowly pay Haley back $20 a week for the rest of your miserable life? Let me clearly, explicitly explain the exact massive legal reality of your current situation. Haley is absolutely not asking you to simply clear her ruined credit score. She's not actively demanding a pathetic apology or a fake payment plan. She has already formally submitted this entire massive red binder directly to the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The absolute sheer terror that violently washed over my father's face was completely indescribable. His jaw dropped open, and his chest began heavily heaving as he desperately struggled to pull oxygen into his panicked lungs. The Internal Revenue Service, Marcus continued smoothly, entirely ignoring my father's massive physical panic. Yes, Richard. You see, when you actively steal a minor child's social security number to fraudulently open dozens of massive credit lines, you're committing severe aggravated identity theft. When you use that highly fraudulent credit to actively illegally hide your personal assets during a federal Chapter 7 bankruptcy proceeding, you're committing massive bankruptcy fraud. And when you deliberately, secretly funnel $40,000 across state lines to legally pay off unregistered, shady gambling syndicates, you're actively committing federal wire fraud and severe tax evasion. These are not simple small misunderstandings, Richard. These are highly serious federal felony charges. The federal agents are not going to ask you to sign a promissory note. They are going to aggressively kick down your front door, actively seize every single physical asset you currently possess, and permanently lock both of you in a federal penitentiary for the next 15 to 20 years. My mother let out a sharp, highly pitched, terrified scream and buried her face completely in her shaking hands. My father looked absolutely entirely paralyzed, his eyes wildly darting back and forth between Marcus and the federal documents. But Marcus, he pleaded desperately, his voice cracking into a high, pathetic whine. We are Jessica's parents. We are the loving grandparents of your beautiful children. You cannot possibly actively allow Haley to send us to federal prison. What will Jessica do? What will your children think when they find out their grandparents are locked away? You have to actively stop Haley from doing this. You have to actively protect your own family. Marcus leaned back slowly in his heavy leather chair, a completely cold, deeply satisfied smile slowly spreading across his handsome face. He had been patiently waiting for exactly this specific moment for over 18 agonizing months. He looked directly deeply into my father's terrified eyes and delivered the absolute final catastrophic blow. You clearly have absolutely no idea what has actively transpired in family court this morning, Richard. He said, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet whisper. I am completely, entirely done protecting Jessica. In fact, I do not have to protect her from anything ever again. The judge officially handed down the final binding custody ruling today at noon. I presented the judge with the exact same highly certified, massive financial documents that Haley just showed you. I explicitly proved to the family court beyond any shadow of a doubt that Jessica was completely, actively complicit in your massive, highly toxic financial fraud. I proved that she recklessly, aggressively spent completely stolen money and secretly opened massive fraudulent credit lines entirely behind my back to fund her fake high society lifestyle, exactly like you taught her to do. The judge was completely, entirely horrified by the massive, undeniable scale of the deep financial abuse. Marcus paused deliberately, letting the heavy, absolute reality of his words fully, completely sink into their panicking brains. So let me give you the exact final legal update, Richard. Jessica has absolutely nothing. The family court judge completely, entirely stripped her of all parental rights due to her severe, massive financial recklessness and her deeply documented, highly toxic sociopathic behavior. I have officially, legally secured full, permanent, exclusive custody of my 2 children. Jessica is completely, permanently, legally barred from ever accessing a single penny of my personal wealth, my corporate assets, or my trust funds. She was forcefully, aggressively evicted from my downtown penthouse this afternoon by armed private security. She is currently completely, entirely broke, highly deeply in debt, and completely, entirely alone. She cannot save you, Richard. She cannot even afford to legally save herself. Your precious, beautiful, flawless golden child is completely, utterly ruined. The complete, massive, absolute destruction of their entire toxic universe was now finally entirely complete. The heavy mahogany table seemed to physically, entirely absorb the remaining oxygen in the room. My parents sat completely, absolutely motionless, entirely destroyed by the highly coordinated, massive legal strike we had just flawlessly executed. They had spent their entire lives aggressively, deeply manipulating everyone around them, maliciously using people as disposable financial shields, and violently discarding anyone who actively threatened their fake, arrogant illusion. They had completely, entirely believed that they were the smartest, most ruthless people in any room they ever entered. But sitting directly across from them were the two quiet, observant victims they had severely underestimated. The invisible, completely discarded scapegoat daughter and the highly polite, constantly manipulated son-in-law had slowly, patiently, quietly formed a massive, highly destructive, absolute alliance and permanently, entirely burned their fake empire to the absolute ground. My mother, Susan, was violently, openly weeping now, but these were no longer her highly weaponized fake tears. These were the raw, deeply ugly, pathetic tears of a highly desperate, completely cornered animal, violently realizing the trap had completely, permanently snapped shut. She rocked back and forth in the heavy leather chair, quietly muttering meaningless apologies to nobody in particular. My father, Richard, just sat completely still, staring blindly entirely at the heavy red binder. He looked entirely incredibly old, entirely utterly defeated, and completely totally broken. The massive, terrifying reality of federal prison was actively, loudly, violently knocking on his front door, and he had absolutely zero legal or financial defense remaining. He had highly aggressively gambled completely everything he ever possessed, and he had finally, absolutely, permanently lost. I stood up slowly from my heavy executive chair, smoothly, aggressively pushing the dark leather away from the table. I looked completely, entirely down at the two people who had actively, biologically created me, but who had never, ever actually been my true parents. I felt absolutely, entirely, completely nothing for them. No anger, no sadness, no lingering childhood trauma, just a highly cold, deeply satisfying sense of complete, absolute final closure. You aggressively, violently threw me out into a freezing winter blizzard with absolutely nothing but a torn thin garbage bag. I said my voice, perfectly, completely, even, and entirely steady. You actively, explicitly, proudly told 30 complete strangers that I was a completely worthless, terrible thief. You aggressively believed that without your massive fake toxic protection, I would simply immediately fail and completely die in the cold. But you completely, entirely forgot one highly crucial detail. You actively forced me to learn exactly how to survive complete, absolute, total betrayal. You actively, aggressively forced me to become highly, deeply observant, incredibly, deeply analytical, and completely, absolutely, entirely unbreakable. You completely, entirely built the exact, specific, massive weapon that ultimately destroyed you. I reached into the small tailored pocket of my evening gown and pulled out my corporate cellular phone. I did not aggressively call the federal police. I had already completely actively done that exactly 3 days ago. The federal arrest warrants were already actively signed and officially sitting on an agent's desk waiting for Monday morning. Instead, I simply pressed a single highly programmed speed dial button. Less than 30 seconds later, the heavy soundproof VIP conference room doors violently swung open. 3 massive, highly trained corporate security guards dressed in immaculate dark suits aggressively immediately stepped into the brightly lit room. They looked directly at me, waiting for my explicit verbal command. I pointed a perfectly manicured, extremely steady finger directly at my terrified, completely broken parents. These 2 individuals are completely, highly unauthorized trespassers. I stated incredibly clearly, my voice echoing powerfully in the room. They aggressively used highly fake credentials to actively breach a private corporate charity event and forcefully attempted to explicitly actively extort massive amounts of money from a senior corporate executive. Please physically, aggressively, immediately escort them completely, entirely off the hotel property right now. Do it completely quietly so you do not actively disturb my wealthy corporate guests in the main ballroom, but make absolutely, entirely, completely sure they are forcefully, permanently removed from the premises and strictly legally barred from ever returning. The massive security guards immediately aggressively moved forward. They did not gently, politely ask my parents to leave. They aggressively, firmly grabbed my father by his dusty, cheap tuxedo jacket and grabbed my mother by her thin, shaking arms, forcefully, aggressively hauling them completely directly up from their leather chairs. My parents did not even attempt to actively fight back. They were completely, entirely, physically and mentally paralyzed by the massive, catastrophic, absolute trauma of their total, complete financial and legal ruin. They actively stumbled blindly, completely, heavily, entirely, completely defeated, as the large corporate security guards aggressively, forcefully dragged them completely toward the heavy wooden door. My father, Richard, actively, slowly turned his deeply grey, sweating, highly terrified face to look entirely back at me one absolute final time. There was absolutely no booming arrogance left in his eyes. There was absolutely no fake manufactured paternal disappointment. There was exactly, absolutely, strictly, only pure, utter, entirely deep, highly pathetic fear. The heavy, soundproof wooden doors completely, entirely, violently swung completely shut, entirely, perfectly swallowing my completely broken parents entirely whole and entirely, actively removing them completely, entirely from my highly successful life, forever. I stood perfectly, entirely, completely still in the brightly lit, quiet room for a very long moment, actively, deeply listening to the complete, absolute, pure, total, beautiful silence. Marcus Sterling slowly stood up from his heavy leather chair, completely, entirely, smoothly buttoning his tailored, dark charcoal suit jacket. He reached completely out and slowly, deliberately closed the massive, thick, heavy red binder, completely, permanently sealing the dark, toxic Jenkins family history entirely forever. He looked directly, completely at me, a highly, deeply genuine, profoundly respectful, entirely warm smile, slowly, entirely, completely touching his sharp, tired eyes. "It is completely, absolutely, entirely, finally over, Haley," he stated incredibly quietly. "We entirely, completely, absolutely won." I slowly, completely, perfectly nodded my head, actively feeling the massive, deep, crushing, agonizing weight of 17 terrible, traumatic childhood years, completely, entirely, instantly, permanently, violently, lifting entirely off my tired shoulders. "Yes, Marcus," I whispered, entirely, completely, softly. "We absolutely, truly, entirely did." I slowly walked over to the large glass window of the private VIP room, looking entirely directly out over the massive, glowing, beautiful city skyline of downtown Chicago. The highly bright city lights sparkled completely perfectly, exactly like a massive field of tiny, beautiful stars against the highly dark night sky. The massive, violent winter storm that had actively, completely frozen my terrified teenage heart 12 long years ago had finally, absolutely, completely, permanently melted entirely away. I had actively, completely, successfully audited my entirely highly traumatic past, and I had forcefully, aggressively, legally balanced the incredibly massive, dark, toxic ledger. My parents were completely, entirely walking directly, aggressively into a highly massive, inescapable federal prison nightmare, and Jessica was completely, entirely, actively, completely facing a deeply, highly lonely, completely, entirely broke, pathetic existence, entirely, completely, entirely devoid of her precious, completely fake luxury and her completely, entirely innocent, beautiful children. They had entirely, completely, absolutely, aggressively built a highly massive, toxic, deeply fragile house of completely, entirely fake cards. And I had highly deliberately, exactly, entirely, carefully, methodically, systematically, violently, completely, entirely blown it, perfectly, utterly, entirely, completely down. I took a very slow, highly deep, completely, entirely clean breath of the highly conditioned, cool air in the private luxury room, completely, entirely, actively feeling the highly, absolute, deep, true, absolute power of my entirely, completely, absolutely, entirely own, completely, entirely independent, highly successful, perfectly, entirely safe, beautiful reality. The highly dark, terrible, pathetic, completely arrogant, highly, completely, absolutely toxic Jenkins family was exactly, completely, entirely, officially, completely dead and entirely completely buried, and Haley Jenkins, the highly successful, deeply powerful, completely unbreakable senior corporate forensic auditor, was completely, entirely, completely, perfectly, absolutely, exactly, completely, entirely ready to finally, entirely, completely, actively, beautifully, truly begin to actually, truly, completely, deeply, absolutely live. 6 months have officially passed since the night the world as I knew it completely ended for my family and began in earnest for me. The transition from the freezing, biting winds of a Chicago winter into the soft, promising warmth of a Midwestern spring has never felt more significant or more symbolic. I found myself driving down the familiar, winding roads of the suburbs yesterday afternoon, with the windows of my car rolled all the way down and the radio playing something quiet and peaceful. I was heading toward the old neighborhood one last time, not because I missed it or because I felt any lingering attachment to the place, but because I needed to see the physical evidence of the absolute closure we had fought so hard to achieve. As I turned onto the street where the massive colonial house stood, I slowed my vehicle to a crawl. The property looked entirely different now. The once perfectly manicured lawn that my father had obsessed over for 20 years was now completely overgrown with thick brown weeds and wild dandelions. The expensive ornamental bushes were shriveled and dead. But the most striking image was the massive bright yellow federal bank foreclosure notice that was aggressively taped to the inside of the large bay window. The house was a hollow shell. Every single piece of designer furniture, every expensive painting, and every high-end appliance had been seized and sold off to satisfy a fraction of the massive debt they had accumulated. I watched from across the street as a young couple walked up the driveway with a set of keys and a bucket of bright blue paint. They looked happy and hopeful. They were starting a life in a house that was no longer haunted by the screams of an angry father or the cold, calculated silence of a manipulative mother. Seeing them there made me realize that the house was finally being cleansed of the toxic legacy the Jenkins family had left behind. It was no longer a monument to stolen money and fake status. It was just a house again. I felt a strange sense of relief as I drove away, knowing that my parents would never set foot on that property ever again. Their kingdom was gone, and the blue door they were painting represented a future that I had helped make possible by removing the rot that lived inside. Richard is currently facing a reality that he never in his wildest, most arrogant dreams thought possible. He's no longer the king of the country club or the respected businessman who could bully anyone into submission. He is a federal defendant. He spends his long, empty days in a tiny, cramped, two-bedroom apartment in a part of the city he used to mock for being poor and dirty. He is currently out on bail, but his world is limited to a small geographical radius determined by the heavy black GPS monitor strapped to his ankle. The weight of that plastic device is a constant reminder of the freedom he is likely about to lose forever. He has been officially charged with multiple counts of aggravated identity theft and federal wire fraud. The evidence Marcus and I provided was so overwhelming and so meticulously organized that his high-priced defense attorneys have basically told him his only real option is to plead guilty and hope for a slightly shorter sentence. But for a man of his age, even a shorter sentence is effectively a life term. He is a broken man. He looks 20 years older than he did at the gala. His hair has turned completely white and his hands shake whenever he tries to pick up a phone that no longer rings. All those friends he thought he had, the men he bought expensive drinks for, and the people he bragged to have vanished into thin air. They do not want to be associated with a man who stole his own daughter's identity to fund a gambling habit and hide a bankruptcy. He is entirely alone in that tiny apartment, staring at the walls and waiting for the gavel to fall. He has lost his house, his car, his reputation, and his dignity. He is finally experiencing the true cost of his greed and his cruelty. Susan has undergone an even more drastic and humiliating transformation. The woman who once lived for designer labels and luxury spa days is now a minimum wage employee at a discount grocery store. She has to wake up at 4 a.m. to catch 2 different city buses just to make it to her shift on time. I saw her once from a distance when I was driving through that neighborhood. She was standing at a bus stop in the rain, clutching a plastic bag and looking utterly defeated. The arrogance that used to define her every movement has been completely replaced by a weary, desperate hunch of her shoulders. She spends her days being yelled at by angry customers over the price of milk or the validity of a coupon. She has no one to order around anymore. She has no one to blame for her problems. She has to face the fact that she chose to help destroy her youngest child, and in doing so, she destroyed herself. She lives in that same cramped apartment with Richard, but they barely speak to each other. They are two ghosts haunted by the memories of the life they threw away for a series of lies that finally caught up to them. She once told me I was no daughter of hers, and now she has to live with the reality that she has no daughter to save her from the life she created. And then there is Jessica, the golden child who was supposed to have the perfect life, the perfect husband, and the perfect future. She is currently living in a studio apartment that is so small the kitchen is practically in the bathroom. It is located right next to the elevated train tracks, and the entire building shakes every 15 minutes as the metal cars roar past. She lost everything in the divorce. Marcus was ruthless because he had to be to protect his children. He secured full custody of the kids, and he made sure that Jessica was legally barred from receiving a single cent of his family wealth. She's now working as a sales associate in a fast fashion retail store at the mall. She spends 8 hours a day on her feet folding cheap t-shirts and dealing with entitled teenagers who treat her exactly the way she used to treat the service staff. She has no college degree and no real work experience because she spent her entire life expecting to be taken care of. Now she has to figure out how to pay rent and buy groceries on a salary that barely covers the basics. She tries to maintain her image on social media, but the cracks are starting to show. The designer bags she posts are from 5 years ago, and the smiles in her photos look forced and hollow. She is discovering that without money and without a family to bail her out, she's just another face in the crowd. She's finally experiencing the life of struggle she always thought I was destined for. The silence from Marcus and the kids is the loudest part of her new life. She's a stranger to her own children because she proved she was a danger to their stability. After I left the old neighborhood, I drove out to the cemetery where Mr. Caldwell was laid to rest. He passed away peacefully in his sleep just a few months ago after seeing me graduate and start my career. He knew the plan was in motion, and he knew I was finally safe. I stood at his grave for a long time holding a bouquet of white lilies. I whispered my thanks to him because I know I would not be the woman I am today without his intervention. He was the one person who looked at a terrified 17-year-old girl in a blizzard and saw someone worth saving. He did not judge me, and he did not ask for anything in return. He just gave me a place to stand while I learned how to fight. I told him that I finally cleared my name. I told him that my credit score is perfect and my career is thriving. I told him that Marcus is happy and the kids are safe. I felt a sense of peace standing there in the quiet cemetery that I have never felt before. The cycle of abuse has been broken. The lies have been exposed. Justice has been served in the most thorough and absolute way possible. He was my real family. As I walked back to my car, I reflected on the journey I have been on. 12 years ago, I was a victim. I was the person things were done to. I was the one who was blamed and the one who was discarded. But I did not stay in that place. I took the pain and the betrayal and I turned them into a professional discipline. I literally spend my life auditing corruption now. I look for the hidden transfers, the forged signatures, and the secret accounts because I know exactly how they are used to hurt people. I have become a shield for the vulnerable because I was once the most vulnerable person in the room. My parents thought they were throwing me into a fire that would consume me. They thought the heat of their hatred and the pressure of their lies would turn me into ash, but they were wrong about the nature of the fire. They did not realize that some things are tempered by the heat. They did not realize that I was not the fuel for their flames. I was the spark. I did not just survive the fire. I learned how to control it. I learned how to use it to illuminate the truth and burn away the deception. I am no longer afraid of the dark, and I am no longer afraid of the cold. I am the senior corporate auditor who finds the truth, and I am the woman who saved herself. I am not Dash. I am the flame. And for the first time in my life, I'm looking forward to the future with absolute certainty. My name is Haley Jenkins, and I am finally free. Every morning when I wake up in my own home, I feel the weight of that freedom. It is not heavy like the debt they saddled me with. It is light And it is powerful. I have built a life on a foundation of honesty and hard work. I have friends who love me for who I am and not what I can do for them. I have a partner in Marcus who respects me as an equal. We are building something real. My parents and Jessica are now just footnotes in a story that belongs entirely to me. They wanted to be the authors of my life, but I took the pen away and I wrote my own ending. I look in the mirror and I see a woman who is strong enough to handle anything the world throws at her. I am grateful for the struggle because it taught me the value of my own worth. I am grateful for the blizzard because it led me to Mr. Caldwell. And I'm grateful for the truth because it set me free. I hope my story serves as a reminder to anyone out there who feels like they are currently standing in the snow. You are not defined by the people who gave up on you. You are not defined by the lies told about you or the mistakes made by those who were supposed to protect you. You are defined by the strength you find to keep going when the world tells you to stop. You have the power to write your own ending, and you have the power to demand justice for yourself. Setting boundaries is not an act of cruelty, it is an act of self-preservation. Removing toxic people from your life is not a betrayal. It is a requirement for your own growth. If this story resonated with you, please let me know where you are watching from and what time it is in the comments below. I love reading your stories of resilience and strength because they remind me that we are never truly alone. Hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story of justice being served. Your support helps these stories reach people who are still trapped in the dark and need to know that there is a way out. Remember that your worth is not a number on a bank statement or a label given to you by people who do not see your light. You are enough and you are strong enough to become your own fire. Thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next story where we continue to celebrate the power of truth and the victory of the human spirit. Take care of yourself and never let anyone extinguish your flame. Looking back at everything that has happened since that freezing Christmas Eve dinner in 2012, I have realized a very powerful truth that I hope stays with you forever. They thought throwing me away would destroy me. They truly believed that by stripping me of my home, my family, and my identity, they were leaving me with nothing but a future filled with failure and despair. But they were fundamentally wrong about who I was and what I was capable of achieving. Instead of breaking me, their cruelty gave me the exact specific tools I needed to eventually hold them fully accountable. My childhood of being the invisible scapegoat forced me to become highly observant, intensely analytical, and incredibly resilient. I learned to read between the lines of their lies and track the tiny inconsistencies in their stories because my survival depended on it. The very skills I use today to uncover massive corporate fraud and dismantle complex criminal networks were forged in the fire of their betrayal. If you are currently feeling like the outcast in your own family, or if you are carrying the weight of being the designated villain, please listen to me very closely. Your perspective is not a burden. Your ability to see the truth that everyone else is trying to hide is your greatest strength. In modern American society, we are often told that family is everything and that we must protect our relatives at all costs. But that rule should never apply to people who are actively destroying you. People will often try to tell you that setting boundaries is an act of cruelty or that you are being cold for protecting your own peace. They will use words like family and loyalty to try and guilt you back into a toxic dynamic that only serves to benefit them while it slowly drains your spirit. But you must understand that setting firm boundaries is not an act of cruelty. It is an absolute requirement for your own survival. You cannot heal in the same environment that made you sick, and you cannot build a healthy future on a foundation of unaddressed abuse. There is a very important distinction that society often fails to make between forgiveness and justice. Forgiveness is a personal, internal choice that you make for your own emotional healing, so that you no longer have to carry the heavy burden of anger and resentment. You can forgive someone in your heart so you can move forward, but that does not mean they should escape the legal consequences of their actions. Justice is a requirement for a functioning society, and it is a requirement for your own dignity. You can choose to find peace in your heart while still demanding that the people who hurt you face the full legal and social weight of their crimes. My parents and Jessica did not deserve my silence. They did not deserve for me to quietly move on and let them continue their fraudulent lives at the expense of others. By holding them accountable, I did not just save myself, I saved future victims, and I finally gave that 17-year-old girl in the snow the voice she was never allowed to have. Do not ever feel guilty for standing up for yourself or for using the truth to protect your worth. You were never the problem. You were just the only person strong enough to survive the solution. If you are currently in a situation where you feel small and unheard, remember that the person who watches from the shadows often sees more than the one standing in the spotlight. Your time to speak will come, and when it does, the truth will be your greatest weapon. If you are still watching this video right now, I want to say a very sincere thank you for letting me share my truth with you today. It took me a very long time to be able to talk about these events without my voice shaking, but sharing this journey with you has been one of the most healing experiences of my entire life. Please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel if you have not done so already. Your support is so incredibly important because it helps these stories reach people all over the country and the world who might be sitting in their own version of that freezing blizzard right now, feeling entirely alone and completely hopeless. Share this video with your friends or anyone you know who needs a powerful reminder that the family scapegoat often becomes the strongest and most successful person in the entire room. We are building a community of survivors here, and our voices are much stronger when we stand together in the clear light of the truth. I am so incredibly curious to know more about the amazing people who are part of this community. Please, do not forget to drop a comment below and let me know exactly where you are watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. I read through your comments every day, and I am constantly moved by your own stories of resilience and your unwavering support for justice. Every time you engage with this channel, you are helping to build a space where truth matters more than toxic illusions and where the voice of the innocent is finally heard. As we wrap up this story, I want you to take a deep breath and really internalize your own incredible value. You are not the labels that other people have tried to place on you. You are not the mistakes of your parents or the jealousy of your siblings. You are the sole architect of your own future, and you have every right to build a life that is beautiful, safe, and entirely your own. Until next time, please continue to aggressively protect your inner peace, know your absolute worth, and never let anyone tell you that you are anything less than enough. You are a warrior, and your story is just beginning. Thank you for being here with me today, and I look forward to connecting with you again very soon in the next video. Take care of yourself and keep shining your light for the world to see. I will see you next time.